very beautiful. She carried herself like a woman. Men loved her.
She wanted to be a wife. She was always looking for love. The police officers came in, they were very kind, but I could tell that something was seriously wrong.
They find a female laying at the bottom of the stairs, curled up in the fetal position, not moving. A male lying on the couch, bleeding severely.
They go upstairs with their guns drawn to check all the rooms.
There were 3 witnesses.
I just knew he was the devil right then and there.
When he was clear, he was the best guy around. When he was on the drugs, there was an evil in his eyes.
You are my everything. Without you, I can't breathe.
He went to the house, he looked in through the window, and he flipped out.
She broke my heart, so I blew hers out.
Colorado Springs is about 70 miles south of Denver.
Colorado Springs area in the 90s was heavily military. There is a U.S. Olympic Training Center here. The U.S. Olympic Committee was based right here in Colorado Springs for quite a while. And they built a really state-of-the-art training center. So they trained all kinds of different athletes.
On February 4th, 1993, Colorado Springs Police Dispatch receives a panicked 911 call from a townhome on Vail Pass Drive.
The police department received a notification about 1:58 a.m. of a domestic violence disturbance at this location.
Moments later, a second call comes in. This time, the caller reports gunfire.
That's updated to shots being fired. When that happens, you have a lot more units responding.
Police arrive and they're responding to a shots fired call. They need to secure the scene first, so they have their guns drawn.
The door was open, so they enter the residence. They find a female laying at the bottom of the stairs. She's curled up in the fetal position, not moving. They observe a male. He is bleeding severely on the couch, but he is still breathing.
They ask, who did this? And the only thing that he can say is, help me.
With both victims suffering from what appear to be life-threatening injuries, paramedics work quickly to get them into ambulances.
With all of this going on, the police are still very cautious. They begin to climb the stairs with their guns drawn because they're not sure if the suspect is still in the home or not.
They go upstairs to check all the rooms. They make sure that the suspect is no longer there.
Instead, they find the unexpected.
They'd noticed 3 children in one of the rooms.
We stayed in the room. The police officers came in. They were very kind. They looked like, everybody was very distraught. I could tell that something was seriously wrong in a lot of their faces.
At the same time, a woman, Gwen Watson, shows up at the scene.
Gwen did leave the residence to go call 911 to get police response. She comes running back in after police are on scene.
Gwen tells police that she does know the victims in the home, that the woman at the bottom of the stairs is Pam Edwards, her friend, and that Frederick Hill, he was the man who they found on the couch.
Gwen says the boy is her son. 2 young girls, 8-year-old Lamaya and 7-year-old Tanea, belong to Pam.
It was me, Tanea, Gwen, and Robert. You can go through so many experiences in your life, right? A lot of memories, a lot of things. Some things you remember, some things you don't. But that kind of trauma just don't never leave. It doesn't. It's there.
Pamela Edwards was born on January 14th, 1967, in Winona, Mississippi.
And it was 7 of us, 4 girls, 3 boys, and my mother. We left Mississippi when I was 13. So we ended up living there in Colorado. Pam, let me tell you, she just was a joy. And when she was alive in people's life, everybody loved her. Even when she was small to when she was growing up. Everybody loved being around Pam.
As a teenager, Pam fell in love for the first time. Motherhood followed.
I was military, and majority of the time, I wasn't around, but I knew she was in love with him. I knew she was in love with him.
Lamaya was born in 1984, followed by Tanea the following year.
She was the mother. And, at a young age, you really don't know much about caring, but she cared for her kids.
Growing up with her was fun. We would have fun times. She used to like to build tents and play like Army Force and do crazy things with us.
She was always full of adventures, just always having something going on. If we were walking up the stairs, she would have a little cute song to go up the stairs to. She would make a song about cleaning the room. Everything was like a song and dance with this lady. That's my mom.
Pam's relationship with the girl's father didn't last, but her dedication to her kids did not waver.
She worked. That's one thing she always did was work. She was gonna provide and make sure that they have a home.
She was a nurse today, and she loved her patients like they were her family, and they loved her.
She always came home and spoke about them. Sometimes she would cry when some of them passed away. Like, she was really, really a caring person, and she loved what she did.
Despite her busy schedule, Pam paid careful attention to her appearance.
She was like a Marilyn Monroe. She was fashionista. You never caught her off guard. I mean, she was always together.
She wanted to be a wife. She wanted a family, so she was always looking for love in a man all the time. Even though she had me and my sister, she always wanted, the father.
On October 21st, 1990, 23-year-old Pam married an aspiring basketball player named Eugene Edwards.
She liked the guys that were very athletic.
He was like on his way to being a professional basketball player. He played in college, he won CBA, and basketball was his life. My stepdad was amazing. They loved him. And he loved my mom too. They were young. They had a young, beautiful love.
But after 3 years of marriage, Eugene's busy career took a toll.
He was traveling for the NBA and doing all those, and he had women always at his heels. They would take breaks often. They separated, but it was like he was still trying to come back. They were still trying to work on it, but I think both of them were seeing other people. She went to the gym all the time. She always used to go after work. She would work out and stay fit. That's where she met Jamal.
He is a boxer at the Olympic Training Center. He was very athletic, tall, handsome. He was an Olympic hopeful, and she was really into him.
We all called him Jamal. That's what he was introduced to us by. But his name was Sammy Lee Denson.
I just remember thinking he was a giant, and he was really cool, automatically joking with us. And he took us to the carnival. We rode rides together. She was seeing Jamal and still trying to figure out what she wanted to do in her marriage.
But for Jamal, there was no question. He was in love.
When Pam walked in the room, people just crowded her. Men loved her. She was beautiful. She was very beautiful. She carried herself like a woman.
But in February of 1993, 26-year-old Pam is being rushed by ambulance to a local hospital after suffering multiple gunshot wounds.
When I first arrived on scene, I also found out that there were 3 children present and an adult female present upstairs. I learned that the adult female had 1 child up there, and the other 2 children were the children of Pam Edwards.
I remember him telling me, like, we all have guns, you're safe. All those people out there, they have guns, we're gonna protect you. So I remember them being like, making me feel really safe. I felt safe as soon as they came.
They isolate us all in one room, in my mom's room, upstairs. We were in that room, it felt like days and hours. They wouldn't let us come down because it was a crime scene.
We didn't want to bring them down because they would have had to pass right over the worst contaminated area of the scene, blood contamination of the scene, and it would have been a little more traumatic than we were willing to put these kids through. Officers are securing the scene, 1, to protect the scene from being contaminated, and 2, to protect our witnesses, the kids and Gwen. And those were our primary witnesses, and also in case the guy comes back.
Colorado Springs police are on the scene of a shooting. Victims 26-year-old Pamela Edwards and 25-year-old Frederick Hill have been rushed to nearby hospitals. Soon after investigators arrive, they get an update from hospital staff.
1 went to one hospital, 1 went to the other hospital. Frederick Hill was being treated for multiple gunshot wounds. He would hopefully be a witness if he survived.
But Pam Edwards will never tell her story.
The female victim, which was identified as Pam Edwards, had been pronounced dead by the time she had arrived at the hospital.
Pam suffered 4 gunshot wounds.
1 was described as a perforating wound to the arm. A bullet had passed through the hand. 1 was described as a penetrating wound to the chest where it entered the body but didn't exit. And a 3rd was identified as a perforating wound to the abdomen, exiting through the backside, the bottom, the rear. The wound that was in their chest had actually perforated the aorta, and that was identified as the kill shot.
Homicide detectives take stock of the townhome where the shooting took place.
Once you enter the scene, you can see where 1 victim had been shot and had bled excessively on the floor right at the base of the stairs. You could get into the living room area. You could also see where another victim had apparently been shot and either came to rest on the couch or was laying on the couch when he was shot because there was a large quantity of blood in that area. You could see a couple shell casings, small caliber semi-automatic handgun. The shell casings were .380 automatic. The front door was open. It wasn't forced open. There's no damage to indicate it was a kick-in or anything like that.
Investigators believe someone let the assailant in.
Then police needed to interview everybody in the house, and so that was Gwen.
Gwen tells them she'd fallen on hard times, and Pam had taken her in until she got back on her feet.
Gwen and my mom, they became friends from the mutual friend. She had a little son, and she didn't have anywhere to go. I think she left her mom's house, and she needed somewhere to stay.
Gwen tells investigators that earlier in the night, they watched a movie with the kids and then put them to bed.
A short time later, another party came by the name of Kenny. Gwen explained to me that Kenny was a party she knew as Frederick Kenneth Hill. He'd go by Frederick, he'd go by Kenny. He was the 2nd victim in the case.
At some point in the night, Gwen reports that she went upstairs to make a phone call and left Frederick and Pam downstairs.
She then hears banging at the door, saying, "Let me in." She tells us by the voice that she's hearing, she knows it to be Jamal.
Gwen tells police that Jamal is a 6'4" man who is also Pam's boyfriend. And before Gwen knows it, she hears at least 5 gunshots go off in the house.
After not hearing something for a little bit of time, she's hoping Jamal has left. She thinks he has because she hasn't heard anything, so she goes down to check. She sees Pam crumpled down at the bottom of the stairs, laying in a fetal position. She can hear the person she identified as Kenny kind of making some sounds. She sees Kenny laying on the couch that had a lot of blood on his leg.
She rushes back upstairs, gets on the phone, calls 911, but she's worried that Jamal might still be in the house and could hear her if she speaks on the phone, so she hangs up. Then she's worried that, 911 might call back and Jamal might hear the phone ring, so she unplugs the phone. She knows she needs help, so she runs out of the house, goes to a neighbor to call 911.
As Gwen finishes her story, one of Pam's daughters speaks up.
Lamaya, the 8-year-old, she tells police, I saw things.
I was literally on the foyer of the townhome when I was at the top and I was looking down watching.
In February 1993, Colorado Springs detectives are investigating the fatal shooting of 26-year-old Pamela Edwards. Pam's daughters tell investigators they were awakened by arguing.
Frederick Kenneth Hill and my mother and Gwen were all awake downstairs before I went to sleep. It was like a heated conversation between Kenny and Gwen, because it was like some loud talking going on, but I didn't know, exactly what was being said.
She also advised that there was a relationship between Gwen and Frederick. She describes him as being intoxicated and arguing.
And my mom was like, you guys can't have this going. And my mother was trying to get him to calm down.
Gwen ends up going upstairs and is talking to some friends on the phone while Pam and Frederick are hanging out down in the living room.
Tanea says she fell asleep, but Lamaya was still awake a few minutes later when she heard pounding on the front door.
Boom, 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 boom. My mom's like, hold on a minute.
Lamaya was awake and did hear some of the commotion going on downstairs. She went to the top of the stairs and looked down.
When I was at the top and I was looking down watching, and my mother opened the door. He's oh, you're trying to mess with this guy. And she's like, no, Jamal. And I just remember watching the first bullet. I watched the first bullet as she was trying to put her hands up to protect herself. And then he shot again, then he turned the gun on Kenny.
Jamal fled through the front door.
And I was just standing there screaming and yelling and screaming, Mommy. But I was in real life shock. Nobody knows what that means, real life shock, where you wanna move and your body cannot even move. You wanna run and your body can't even run. The only thing that I was able to do was scream. My mom was still laying there and she was breathing really heavy and Kenny was screaming for help. He was like, please, hurry up, please. Please help me, please.
Lamaya rushed back to her sister in the bedroom.
I remember my sister running, saying, Mom's dead, Tanea, Mom's dead. And I'm like, what? I just was frozen, what? She's dead. And I got up and we went to the edge of the stairs and I saw her. And she was curled up in a fetal position. There was a lot of blood coming from up underneath her. And it looked like she was trying to talk, but it was blood coming from her mouth as well. It looked like she was trying to tell us to go back upstairs. I ran to the bottom of the stairs and she tried to cover my eyes and I just ran to my mom. I was trying to help her. Mm-hmm.
Tanaya told police that while she was downstairs, Jamal actually came back in the house and went upstairs. Tanaya also went upstairs to hide in her room, but she was able to see what was going on.
He ran upstairs and he had an extra pair of clothes, and he changed the clothes that he had on, and he left.
He went to the trouble of changing his clothes when he was still at Pam's house, but he put his blue Olympic jacket back on.
Then investigators noticed something clutched in Lamaya's tiny hand.
This letter from Jamal to Pam is clearly discussing a recent breakup, how it's torturing Jamal, how he wants to be back with her, and how difficult this process has been for him.
Jamal describes his obsession with Pam and how his uncertainty is becoming unbearable.
You are my everything. Without you, I can't breathe. You are the one who just fills my day.
It was even signed Jamal, or Jay with a couple hyphens.
Gwen and the girls tell investigators that this wasn't the first time Jamal was violent with Pam.
Gwen described this relationship as happening for about a year and a half. And the relationship with Jamal and Pam starting out very well, but that things became quite turbulent, and that especially in the last few months, things had really starting to break down.
I'll never forget when I met him, he brought like a bag of Cheetos and some Mountain Dew when he walked in our house. And I just knew he was the devil right then and there.
We were at one of his boxing matches, and like he came out of the ring and started fighting the guys that were sitting and watching the fight because he thought my mother and them were giving each other the eye. And he beat up 2 of those guys at one time. And yeah, it was like so crazy. The whole boxing match got canceled and they had to call the police, and he was just like, oh, it was so scary. And then after we went to the hotel room, and I think that's the first time I witnessed her getting beat up by him.
Jamal was the type of, oh, I'm sorry, Pam, with the gifts and things like that. So it'd be, oh, Pam, I got this for you, I got that. So it would always be like a type of gift to wing his way back in to get into her life. And then a week or 2 later, then the beatings start.
There was one time he went to jail for beating her up real bad, gave her black eyes, and broke her arm.
Pam had enough. She filed a restraining order.
Restraining orders are obviously, they're only as good as the piece of paper they're written on, because if the guy's not going to buy it doesn't mean anything. It's not going to get up and protect you. This appeared to be a domestic violence homicide.
Investigators immediately launch a manhunt for Sammy Denson, aka Jamal.
We were able to positively identify who Jamal was because of what Lamaya had told me. She stated that yes, everybody knew him by Jamal, but she knew him as Sammy Denson also because that's the name he used when he was boxing.
And so the dispatch airs a description of the suspect. They air that they're looking for a 6'4" black man, about 200 pounds, around 27 years old, who is wearing a black Olympic jacket.
Before the hunt has time to amp up, another disturbing call comes into 911.
We're still processing the scene and preparing things when the police department received a telephone call from a party who made a very simple statement as I shot those 2 people. And that started a whole nother ball rolling.
Colorado Springs police are still at the townhome where Pam Edwards lost her life in a fatal shooting just hours earlier, when another 911 call comes into dispatch.
This 911 operator received a telephone call approximately 3:50 in the morning from a party who basically stated that he was sorry that he had shot the people at Vail Pass Drive. That was our crime scene, so it was pretty much sure we're probably talking to the suspect. Before she's able to get any information, he hangs up the phone.
Police then trace that call, and they find that the call was made from a payphone at a loafing jug on Pikes Peak Avenue.
Officers were dispatched to go to that location. They were provided the suspect information that we had. It was the clothing description. And one of the particular items of clothing description was a Olympic Training Center jacket. There's an officer just happened to be close, so he pulled in. He didn't see anybody at the payphone. He did notice that in this little convenience store, they had a little seating area to where you buy some food and sit down and eat or drink a cup of coffee, and there were 3 people there.
They notice that one gentleman stands up, and they notice, hey man, he kind of fits the description. Plus, he has on Olympic gear.
As more patrol cars arrive, the man steps outside.
They have a bunch of officers, and they are approaching very carefully. That's a big guy, and he's a boxer. He's a pre-Olympic boxer. He is in stellar shape. That means he's going to be strong, he's going to be fast, he's going to be mean, and he's going to know how to throw a punch.
They want to talk to him, and when they try to stop him, they say, if you move, you are dead, but he still decides to take off. The police are behind him about 10 or 15 yards, and as he's running, he's able to jump 2 fences.
They finally catch up to him at a house, and it takes, at that point, 10 police officers to bring him down.
Upon his arrest, he's searched per the officers. In the course of that arrest, they took everything from him to include some suspected crack cocaine, drug paraphernalia, a pipe and screen used for smoking crack cocaine.
Police don't find any weapons on Sammy Dennison.
He is immediately transported to the Major Crimes Unit of the police department for the purpose of an interview.
Sammy was charged with 1 count of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder in the first degree and 2 counts of crime of violence.
They also file 1 count of possession of a Schedule II controlled substance for the crack that they found.
So while the suspect was being arrested, there was still, of course, some police officers at the Loaf and Jug. They were, again, processing the scene. And the 2 gentlemen that were with the suspect, they approached the police and introduced themselves.
Ruben Caro was the bondsman who had bonded Sammy out of jail on his last incident. Richard Wood was the coach for Sammy Denson.
So we told them who we were, how we were associated with Sammy. And they said, well, we need you to come down to the station and answer some questions.
At the station, Richard Wood gives investigators background on the man he believed was bound for Olympic gold.
Sammy Denson is his boxing name because you have to use your given name that is on your passport ID. And that was his given name, and that's what he had to use. He wanted the Muslim faith, and that's what he adopted from Sammy to Jamal. I had the #1 gym in Colorado at the time, and he just walked in. He advanced so quickly. He had won the state tournaments. He beat everybody in the state, the regions, and then went to the nationals all in the first year. He was on track to go to the Olympics. In 1993, he was the 3rd ranked heavyweight in the nation.
But Sammy veered off course.
We didn't know when he started the drugs. He wasn't on them when he first started. When he was clear, he was the best guy around. When he was on the drugs, you could tell because there was an evil in his eyes.
The day after the shooting death of Pamela Edwards, police have arrested her boyfriend, Sammy Denson, aka Jamal. While Sammy is processed, Colorado Springs detectives question his boxing coach.
He could have been, from all statements made, a contender in the Olympics, but he let 2 things get a hold of him. 1, drugs, and 2, his inability to handle personal problems.
Richard Wood explains that he got a panicked call from Sammy in the middle of the night, just after the shooting.
And it was between midnight and 2 o'clock. I got the call, and it was Sammy, and he was talking incoherently and everything.
Sammy's friend and bail bondsman Ruben Caro was in the car with him.
And Reuben said, Dickie, he said serious stuff. And I said, all right, you can pick me up. And I got in the back seat, and Sammy was in the front, and Reuben was driving. The energy when I got in the car was just off the charts. The anxiety, the nervousness, and him being nervous and moving and everything, plus the fact that he was on drugs, and he was moving and jerking and everything, and Reuben was driving with his eyes just fixed on the road, just scared to death himself. And I got mad because he was waving the gun around and scaring me that it could go off and everything, because he wasn't being very lucid. He was just completely gone. And so when I slapped him and said, Sammy, put the gun away, he listened right away and stuck the gun right in his pocket.
They convinced Sammy to stop at the convenience store to talk through what had him so upset.
So we went in and we sat down in the little booth there, and we were talking and everything, and I said, what happened? And he told me that he went to our house.
When he went to the house, he looked in through the window and he saw Freddie sitting on the couch with Pam. He flipped out.
He sees what he thinks is a makeout session between Frederick and Pam.
When he seen them on the couch together, he said he lost his mind.
He knocks on the door. Pam asks who it is, and he says, it's me, and that's when he busts through the door.
He knocked her down, he put the gun to her heart and pulled the trigger. And then he shot Fred, too.
Sammy was determined to get revenge.
He told me, he said, she broke my heart, so I blew hers out. Exact words.
Reuben and Richard told Sammy he needed to call 911 right away.
I said, we've got to call to see if she's okay. We've got to report it. I said, Sammy, you need to go out and make the phone call. And so he went out and made the phone call.
Moments later, the police closed in.
I'm looking out at the street, and all of a sudden there's one cop car. Then there was another cop car. Then I see like 5 cop cars just driving around the convenience store, but none of them are stopping or anything. And then all of a sudden, one stops and pulls out. And I told Sammy, I said, you got to get out of here.
They also stated that they had seen the weapon and that it was on his body at the time that he took flight.
Investigators send officers to see if Sammy dumped the gun when he ran away.
It was imperative that we try to find this weapon for public safety and evidence. Multiple officers, including 2 K-9 units, were dispatched to the area for the purpose of doing article searches. We were unable at that time. No officer came across the weapon, and we did not recover it during the course of this investigation.
Back at the station, detectives sit down with Sammy.
I advised Sammy of his rights per Miranda and asked him whether he understood those rights, which he stated he did. I then asked if he's willing to waive those rights and grant me an interview. He said no in a roundabout way. He said he was high and didn't want to get himself in any trouble. Once he says he will not conduct an interview with me, all attempts to interview him are ended at that point, and that's what happened.
On February 9th, less than a week after the shooting, Frederick Kenny Hill has recovered enough from his injuries to give a statement.
Frederick Hill was wounded by 2 shots. One that passed through his forearm and entered his upper chest, and the second one grazed his forehead.
Officers go to the hospital to interview Frederick Hill and attempts to get a positive identification on the suspect.
And I show him a photographic lineup of 6 individuals. He's able to positively identify the person I knew as Sammy Denson as being the person that was in the house and actually shot him.
A few weeks later, Sammy Denson's legal team submits a plea of not guilty.
They don't have a lot of forensic evidence. They don't have DNA, and they certainly don't have the murder weapon. They don't have the gun, even though they spent hours that night searching for it. What they do have is really impactful eyewitness statements. But the fact that Some of these witness statements were from children under the age of 10, could call their credibility and their reliability into question.
In August of 1993, Sammy Denson goes on trial for the first-degree murder of Pamela Edwards and the attempted murder of Frederick Kenny Hill. The prosecution presents a long list of eyewitnesses.
Gwen Watson, she was able to share, again with the jury, this history of abuse. And of course, she was able to tell the jury what she observed that night, that she saw Jamal or Sammy in the house shooting Pam and killing her. Frederick Hill, he was able to describe viscerally for the jury the savagery that he endured that night when he was shot 3 times. Ruben Caro, the bondsman, and Richard Wood also testified and talked to the jury about that car ride in the hours after the shooting, how Sammy admitted guilt to him and how they had to convince him to call police.
But the most powerful moments come when Pam's daughters take the stand.
They were still very, very young, and they showed up dressed in what looked like church dresses. Tanaya took the witness stand, her feet dangling and unable to reach the floor. And knowing that Sammy was sitting not far from her, she was able to calmly describe what she had seen that night, the night her mom was murdered.
I remember they asked, is the person that hurt your mom here in the courtroom? And I pointed to him. When I did that, he just looked down. He wouldn't look at me, he just looked down.
Although I was young, I just wanted to be a warrior for my mom and stand strong. I just remember that going in that courtroom and him just being heartless. Not a heart or a care in this world. Like 2 little girls. You were such a coward. You took a mother from 2 little girls. You coward man.
For the defense, they had to attack these witness statements. And really, they just tried to show that nobody really knew what happened that night.
When you can't attack the evidence, defense will attack the individuals.
The defense also wants to make sure the jury understands that the murder weapon here hasn't been found. That even though the gun supposedly was with Sammy the entire time, up to and including in that car with Ruben, somehow the gun has never been found. They try to say that that shows that the burden of proof that the prosecutor hasn't been met.
The jury deliberated about 4.5 hours when they returned with a verdict of guilty to 1 count of first-degree murder for killing Pam Edwards, 1 count of attempted first-degree murder in the shooting of Frederick Hill, 2 counts of crime of violence, and 1 count of possession of Schedule II controlled substance.
When they told me that Jamal was gonna spend his life in prison without parole, that was definitely his payback. He deserves to be there. He deserves to spend his life there. He tortured children.
2 months later, he is sentenced to life without parole on all charges. Over a year later, Sammy's weapon is found.
On May 25th, 1994, Colorado Springs police were again called by a resident of the neighborhood where Sammy Denson was ultimately arrested. This neighbor was trimming his rose bushes and he recognized it as a gun. He remembered from when that search and arrest happened that police were looking to see if anyone had found a weapon, and so he wanted to call police immediately.
He definitely wanted to get revenge for her playing with his heart, or that he felt she was playing with him, you know, having another man in the house. You know, this is what happens when you play with me. I told you to stay away.
Boston, Massachusetts. The city was sleeping under a blanket of summer heat. Streetlights cast long amber reflections across quiet sidewalks. Apartment windows glowed softly in the darkness like distant lanterns, each one holding an ordinary life behind it. A woman finished washing dishes before bed. Another sat alone with a book in her lap. Somewhere, a radio murmured through the night. Somewhere else, a television flickered behind drawn curtains. Nothing seemed unusual. Nothing seemed dangerous. And yet, hidden among the countless faces moving through the city, someone was watching. Not watching a crowd. Not watching a neighborhood. Watching individuals. Watching women. Watching doors. Watching routines. Studying moments when loneliness settled into a room and no one would hear a cry for help. The fear that would eventually grip Boston did not arrive all at once. It crept through the city like fog rolling in from the harbor. At first, it was only a headline. A tragic death. Then another. Then another. The names changed. The addresses changed. The ages changed. But the violence remained hauntingly familiar. No one knew it then, but a nightmare was already unfolding. A nightmare that would leave 13 women dead. A nightmare that would transform one of America's oldest cities into a landscape of locked doors, drawn curtains, and sleepless nights. A nightmare attached to a name that would become infamous across the world. The Boston Strangler. Even today, more than half a century later, that name still carries a chilling weight. It conjures images of dark hallways, frightened residents, frantic police investigations, and unanswered questions. It evokes memories of a killer who seemed capable of slipping through walls, entering homes without force, and vanishing without a trace. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the story is this. No one can say with complete certainty who the Boston Strangler really was. Was he one man? Were there several killers? Did investigators focus on the wrong suspect? Did a confession solve the mystery or deepen it? For decades, these questions have lingered like ghosts. And to understand why, we have to return to the beginning. Not to the arrest. Not to the confession. Not to the courtroom debates. We have to return to the victims. Because before there was a legend, before there was a headline, before there was a terrifying nickname repeated across newspapers and television broadcasts, there were real women living real lives. Women with families. Women with dreams. Women with routines so ordinary that they could have belonged to anyone. Women who never imagined that opening their front door could become the final decision they would ever make. The story begins in the summer of 1962. America was changing. The post-war optimism of the 1950s still lingered in many neighborhoods. New cars filled driveways. Television sets occupied living rooms across the country. Families gathered around dinner tables believing the future would be brighter than the past. Boston reflected much of that confidence. Its streets were alive with students, workers, shopkeepers, and immigrants building new lives. Historic brick buildings stood alongside modern developments. Churches filled every neighborhood. Children played in parks. Elderly residents sat on apartment stoops during warm evenings and exchanged stories with neighbors. It was not a city that expected to become the setting of one of the most notorious murder investigations in American history. Yet evil rarely announces its arrival. It does not arrive with sirens. It does not send warnings. Instead, it often enters quietly. A knock at the door. A smile. A polite introduction. A believable lie. Investigators would later spend years trying to understand how so many victims appeared to have let their killer inside willingly. That detail haunted detectives more than almost anything else. Many of the crime scenes lacked signs of forced entry. No shattered locks. No broken windows. No splintered door frames. Whoever entered those apartments often seemed to have been invited in. Imagine that for a moment. Imagine hearing a knock. Imagine seeing someone standing outside your apartment. Perhaps he appears professional. Perhaps he carries papers. Perhaps he claims to be a maintenance worker, a repairman, or someone conducting a survey. Perhaps he smiles. Perhaps he sounds trustworthy. Then imagine opening the door and unknowingly allowing death to walk into your home. That possibility terrified Boston residents because it shattered one of the most basic assumptions people hold about safety. Home is supposed to be a refuge. A place where danger remains outside. A place protected by locks, walls, and familiar surroundings. But the crimes associated with the Boston Strangler suggested something far more frightening. The danger was not outside. The danger could step directly into your living room. As investigators struggled to identify the killer, rumors spread throughout the city. Women discussed the murders in beauty salons. Men debated theories in bars. Newspapers printed updates whenever another victim was discovered. Each new development generated more speculation. Some believed the killer was a local resident. Others suspected a traveling predator. Some imagined a charming stranger. Others pictured a violent madman lurking in shadows. Everyone had theories. No one had answers. And while the public searched for explanations, the body count continued to rise. The victims themselves seemed to defy expectations. Many serial killers target a specific type of person. A particular age. A particular appearance. A particular lifestyle. But the Boston murders appeared far more complicated. Some victims were elderly. Others were young. Some lived alone. Others had active social lives. The age range stretched from teenagers to women in their 80s. To detectives, this inconsistency was deeply unsettling. It suggested either an unusually unpredictable killer or multiple offenders whose crimes were being linked together. That uncertainty would become one of the defining features of the entire case. Even now, historians, criminologists, and retired investigators continue debating whether all 13 murders truly belonged to the same offender. But in the early days of the investigation, police had an immediate problem. The killings needed to stop. And they had no idea who was responsible. Every morning brought the possibility of another victim. Every ringing telephone carried the potential for terrible news. Every homicide scene introduced new questions. The pressure mounted relentlessly. Police departments from different jurisdictions attempted to coordinate information. Detectives worked long hours reviewing reports. Investigators compared witness statements. Forensic specialists examined evidence using the limited scientific tools available in the early 1960s. Yet despite these efforts, the killer remained invisible. Invisible, but not inactive. Somewhere in Boston, or perhaps beyond it, someone continued moving through everyday life. Someone bought groceries. Someone walked streets filled with ordinary people. Someone exchanged casual greetings with neighbors. Someone blended into the background. And when the opportunity appeared, someone killed. The image is disturbing because it challenges our instinctive understanding of monsters. We want monsters to look different. We want them to stand out. We want warning signs. The Boston Strangler case offered very few. Instead, it suggested a predator capable of appearing normal. Capable of earning trust. Capable of disappearing into the crowd moments after committing unimaginable violence. As the murders accumulated, fear transformed daily behavior throughout the city. Women stopped answering doors without verifying identities. Hardware stores reported increased sales of locks. Neighbors checked on each other more frequently. Some residents refused to remain alone after dark. Others moved in temporarily with relatives. The fear was not confined to one neighborhood. It spread across Boston like an infection. Every victim made the threat feel closer. Every headline intensified anxiety. Every unanswered question amplified panic. Parents worried about daughters. Husbands worried about wives. Children worried about aging mothers who lived alone. The murders became more than criminal investigations. They became psychological assaults on an entire city. And the media ensured that no one could ignore them. Newspapers competed for details. Radio broadcasts discussed developments. Television stations analyzed the investigation. The public consumed every update. The name Boston Strangler soon became embedded in the national consciousness. It was dramatic, memorable, terrifying. But there was a hidden danger in that nickname. It simplified a deeply complex mystery. A nickname creates the illusion of certainty. One killer. One identity. One explanation. Reality was far less clear. Behind the headlines lay confusion, contradictions, and unanswered questions that would persist for decades. Years later, when a man named Albert DeSalvo emerged as the primary suspect, many people desperately wanted closure. A face. A name. A solution. Something to bring order to the chaos. But even that apparent breakthrough would create new mysteries. Mysteries that continue to fuel debate today. Because while DeSalvo confessed to being the Boston Strangler, confessions are not always as straightforward as they seem. Why did he know details that had never been released publicly? Why did certain pieces of evidence fail to match him? Why did witness descriptions sometimes contradict his appearance? Why were investigators themselves divided? And perhaps most importantly, why do so many experts remain uncertain after all these years? Those questions remain waiting in the shadows of this story. Questions we will eventually confront. But before we reach confessions, arrests, and DNA breakthroughs, we must walk through the darkness that came first. We must meet the women whose lives were stolen. We must witness the city as fear tightened its grip. We must follow detectives as they chased leads that dissolved into nothing. We must experience the uncertainty that consumed Boston during those years. Because history often compresses tragedies into simple narratives. A killer. A hunt. An arrest. A conclusion. The reality is rarely that neat. The reality is filled with grief. Filled with mistakes. Filled with coincidences. Filled with moments where a single decision might have changed everything. The Boston Strangler case is not merely the story of a serial killer. It is the story of a city living under siege from an invisible threat. It is the story of investigators struggling against limited technology and overwhelming pressure. It is the story of victims whose names risk being overshadowed by the legend of the man who may or may not have killed them. And it is the story of a mystery that refuses to die. Even now, decades later, the questions linger. Who was truly responsible? How many killers were involved? Was justice ever fully achieved? Or did one of America's most infamous murder cases leave behind secrets that will never be uncovered? To answer those questions, we must return to Boston. Back to the early 1960s. Back to a city that had no idea what was coming. Back to the first victims. Back to the first signs that something terrible was unfolding behind closed apartment doors. Back to the beginning of a nightmare that would change Boston forever. In the early 1960s, Boston was a city caught between two worlds. On one side stood the old city, built from generations of tradition, immigration, faith, and tightly connected neighborhoods. On the other stood a rapidly changing America, one entering an era of social transformation, technological growth, and cultural uncertainty. The city breathed history. Red brick buildings lined narrow streets that had existed long before automobiles appeared. Church bells echoed across neighborhoods every Sunday morning. Corner stores knew their customers by name. Elderly residents sat by apartment windows and watched the rhythms of everyday life unfold below them. Boston was not perfect. Like every major American city, it struggled with poverty, overcrowding, social divisions, and crime. But in the summer of 1962, most residents still believed danger followed predictable rules. Danger existed in dark alleys. Danger existed among gangs. Danger existed in rough neighborhoods after midnight. Danger did not usually enter an elderly woman's apartment in broad daylight. Danger did not politely knock before stepping inside. And danger certainly did not leave almost no trace behind. That assumption was about to be shattered. To understand the terror that would eventually consume Boston, it is important to understand the people who lived there. Many women, particularly widows and elderly residents, lived alone in apartment buildings scattered throughout the city. These apartments were often modest but comfortable. A small kitchen. A sitting room. Photographs of children and grandchildren displayed proudly on shelves. Religious symbols hanging on walls. Knitted blankets folded neatly over chairs. The scent of coffee lingering in the air. Lives built over decades occupied these spaces. Lives filled with ordinary routines. Morning tea. Grocery shopping. Conversations with neighbors. Telephone calls with family members. Television programs watched before bed. Nothing extraordinary. Nothing that would ever attract newspaper headlines. For many older women, trust remained an important part of daily life. This was a generation raised to believe in courtesy. People opened doors. People helped strangers. People listened when someone claimed to represent a utility company or building management. The world felt smaller then. Safer. At least it appeared that way. Many apartment buildings lacked sophisticated security systems. Doors were often unlocked during the day. Residents recognized familiar faces. Unexpected visitors were not automatically viewed with suspicion. That trust would become one of the most tragic themes in the Boston Strangler story, because investigators would later discover a disturbing pattern. Many victims appeared to have willingly allowed their killer inside. That possibility changed everything. Before the murders, a knock at the door was insignificant. Afterward, it became a source of anxiety. But that transformation had not happened yet. In 1962, life continued as usual. Children played baseball in parks. Students attended summer classes. Factory workers completed long shifts before returning home. The city moved according to familiar rhythms. And hidden within those rhythms was a man who may have already been searching for victims. No one knows exactly when the hunt began. No one knows when violent fantasies first crossed his mind. No one knows how long he spent observing potential targets before acting. But predators often begin long before the crime itself. They watch. They study. They learn. They search for vulnerabilities invisible to everyone else. A locked door left open. A predictable routine. An isolated apartment. A trusting personality. The qualities that make someone kind can sometimes make them vulnerable. And somewhere in Boston, someone was paying attention. The first known victim associated with the Boston Strangler murders was 55-year-old Anna Sleezers. Anna was not a celebrity. She was not wealthy. She was not politically connected. She was simply a woman living her life. Born in Latvia, she had survived experiences that many people could barely imagine. World War II had reshaped Europe and forced millions from their homes. Like countless immigrants, Anna came to America seeking safety and stability. She eventually settled in Boston. Friends described her as hardworking and independent. The kind of person who endured hardship without complaint. The kind of person who quietly built a life from nothing. By June of 1962, Anna lived alone in an apartment on Gainsborough Street. It was an ordinary residence in an ordinary neighborhood. Nothing about it suggested it would become the site of a crime that would terrify an entire city. On June 14, her son became concerned when he could not reach her. Concern turned into dread. And dread turned into horror. Inside the apartment, Anna was found dead. The scene stunned investigators. She had been sexually assaulted. She had been strangled. The ligature used in the killing came from her own clothing. The violence appeared deeply personal despite the absence of any known personal connection. Detectives immediately began searching for answers. Had she known her attacker? Had she opened the door willingly? Was robbery the motive? Was the crime sexual? Was it random? At that moment, no one understood that Anna's murder would become the opening chapter of something much larger. Police treated the killing seriously, but there was no reason yet to imagine a serial predator stalking Boston. Tragic murders occurred in cities every year. Investigators focused on solving the crime before them. Then another woman died. And then another. As additional victims emerged, similarities became impossible to ignore. One of the most shocking aspects involved age. Serial killers often pursue a consistent victim profile. Yet the emerging pattern in Boston seemed strangely inconsistent. Some victims were elderly women living alone. Others were significantly younger. This inconsistency confused detectives. It challenged traditional assumptions about offender behavior. Were investigators looking for one killer? Or several? At the time, no one knew. Meanwhile, residents knew only what newspapers reported. And newspapers were beginning to notice the pattern. Each article increased public awareness. Each headline intensified concern. People who had never heard of Anna Sleezers suddenly found themselves discussing her murder over breakfast. Families clipped newspaper articles. Neighbors exchanged rumors. Questions multiplied faster than answers. The atmosphere changed gradually. Not overnight. Fear rarely arrives all at once. Instead, it grows through accumulation. One story becomes two. Two become four. Four become six. Eventually, a community begins looking over its shoulder. That process had begun in Boston. The city itself seemed unaware of the storm gathering around it. Summer gave way to autumn. Autumn moved toward winter. The streets remained busy. Streetcars continued running. Storefronts remained illuminated after sunset. People laughed in restaurants and attended church services. Life carried on. Yet beneath the surface, something had shifted. Women became more cautious. Doors were checked twice before bedtime. Unexpected visitors prompted hesitation. Small behavioral changes spread through neighborhoods. Most people hoped the murders would stop. Most believed police would soon identify the offender. Most could not imagine how long the mystery would continue. Nor could they imagine the national attention it would eventually receive. At the center of the growing crisis stood law enforcement agencies facing an unprecedented challenge. Modern forensic science did not yet exist in the form we know today. There was no DNA testing. No advanced surveillance networks. No digital databases connecting information instantly across jurisdictions. Investigators relied heavily on interviews, witness testimony, fingerprints, physical evidence, and intuition. When evidence was limited, progress slowed dramatically. Every crime scene became a puzzle missing crucial pieces. Every witness account contained uncertainties. Every lead required enormous effort. The public often imagines detectives solving crimes through dramatic breakthroughs. The reality is usually far less glamorous. Long hours. Stacks of reports. Repeated interviews. Endless dead ends. The Boston investigation would become all of those things. And worse. Because as detectives searched for answers, the killer appeared to remain one step ahead. No arrests. No clear suspect. No definitive explanation. Only more victims. The psychological impact extended beyond those directly connected to the crimes. Women who lived alone suddenly recognized themselves in newspaper descriptions. An elderly widow reading the morning paper could easily imagine becoming the next target. A young woman returning home after work could picture an unknown man waiting outside her apartment. The murders blurred social boundaries. Age offered no guarantee of safety. Neighborhood offered no guarantee of safety. Routine offered no guarantee of safety. That uncertainty proved uniquely terrifying. Humans are comforted by patterns. We want to believe danger follows rules. The Boston murders seemed to reject those rules entirely. No one knew who might be next. No one knew when the next attack would occur. No one knew whether the killer was watching from nearby. The unknown became more frightening than any confirmed fact. As the months passed, the media played an increasingly significant role. Journalists sought details. Editors demanded updates. Readers consumed every development. The story sold newspapers because it touched a universal fear. The fear of vulnerability. The fear that evil might appear without warning. The fear that ordinary life could suddenly become deadly. The coverage transformed local crimes into a regional obsession. Soon, people beyond Massachusetts were following the story. The murders were no longer merely Boston's problem. They had become a national concern. And yet, despite the growing attention, the fundamental mystery remained unchanged. Who was doing this? Was the offender organized or impulsive? Intelligent or lucky? Local or transient? Acting alone or with assistance? Each theory generated new possibilities. Each possibility generated new questions. The investigation expanded in every direction. Still, certainty remained elusive. Meanwhile, somewhere beyond the newspaper headlines and police briefings, families were grieving. Parents buried daughters. Children buried mothers. Friends attended funerals. Photographs were placed on mantels. Bedrooms remained untouched. Voices disappeared from family gatherings. The public discussed a killer. Families mourned people. That distinction is important. Because behind every famous true crime case lies a collection of personal tragedies. Lives interrupted. Relationships shattered. Future moments erased forever. The victims of the Boston Strangler were not characters in a mystery. They were human beings. And as Boston entered the second half of 1962, more families would soon experience that loss. The city did not know it yet. Police did not know it yet. Future victims certainly did not know it yet. But the nightmare was only beginning. The first murder had already occurred. The pattern was beginning to emerge. Fear was taking root. And somewhere in the shadows of Boston, the person responsible was still free. Before the newspapers gave the killer a name, before investigators assembled task forces, before television reporters stood in front of crime scenes delivering updates to a frightened public, there were women living ordinary lives across Boston. They were not connected by friendship. They did not belong to the same neighborhoods. Many had never met one another. Some were elderly widows who spent quiet afternoons tending houseplants and writing letters to relatives. Others were young women standing at the beginning of adulthood, planning careers, relationships, and futures that stretched far beyond the horizon. Yet history would eventually connect them forever. Not because of who they were, but because of what was taken from them. One of the greatest tragedies in notorious criminal cases is how easily the victims become overshadowed by the offender. The killer's name becomes famous. Books are written. Documentaries are produced. Endless debates emerge about motives, methods, and psychology. Meanwhile, the people whose lives were stolen slowly fade into the background. But to understand the true impact of the Boston Strangler case, we must stop looking at the shadow moving through the city and instead focus on the lives illuminated before that shadow arrived. The first woman commonly associated with the murders was Anna Sleezers. At 55 years old, Anna represented a generation forged by hardship. Long before she became part of an American murder investigation, she had experienced events that reshaped the 20th century. Born in Latvia, she lived through years marked by war, political upheaval, displacement, and uncertainty. Like countless European immigrants who arrived in the United States after World War II, Anna carried memories most people around her could scarcely imagine. America offered something precious. Stability. The chance to begin again. The opportunity to build a life free from the chaos that had consumed much of Europe. Friends and family remembered Anna as practical and independent. She was not someone who sought attention. She worked hard. She maintained her home. She handled problems without complaint. Her apartment reflected the life she had built. Modest furniture. Personal keepsakes. Photographs that connected her to family members. A home filled not with luxury but with familiarity. The kind of place where routines become comforting. The kind of place where a person feels safe. No one could have imagined that the same apartment would eventually become the first chapter in one of America's most infamous criminal mysteries. Then there was Mary Mullen. At 85 years old, Mary belonged to a completely different stage of life. The pace of her days was slower. Her concerns were different. She had lived through decades of history, witnessing changes that transformed the world around her. People who knew Mary described her as kind and deeply rooted in her community. The elderly often develop routines that become almost ritualistic. The same stores. The same conversations. The same daily habits repeated for years. There is comfort in that predictability. There is dignity in it as well. Mary's life reflected that quiet rhythm. Yet when her name appeared in connection with another horrifying murder, the city began to realize something deeply unsettling. The victims did not fit a simple profile. The danger was not confined to one age group. The killer or killers seemed willing to target women whose lives differed dramatically from one another. That realization expanded the fear. because it expanded the pool of potential victims. Then came Nina Nichols, 68 years old. A woman who, like many of the others, lived alone. The details surrounding her death only strengthened the growing belief that investigators were confronting something more than isolated crimes. By now, detectives were beginning to notice patterns. Patterns that made each new homicide increasingly difficult to dismiss as coincidence. The similarities created a chilling narrative. Women alone. Private residences. Strangulation. Signs suggesting the attacker had gained access without forcing entry. The pieces were slowly coming together. Unfortunately, so was the body count. Helen Blake became another name added to the growing list. 65 years old. Like the others, she had a history, relationships, memories, and plans. Every victim possessed an entire lifetime invisible to newspaper headlines. People often encounter names in true crime stories and unconsciously reduce them to statistics. Age. Date of death. Location. Cause of death. But every one of those names represented thousands of ordinary moments. Birthday celebrations. Family dinners. Favorite songs. Private hopes. Small victories. Personal disappointments. Entire worlds that disappeared when violence entered their lives. Helen's death deepened the crisis. The investigation was growing larger. Public concern was intensifying. The media coverage was expanding. Yet answers remained frustratingly out of reach. The next victim, Ida Erger, was 75 years old. She had immigrated to America years earlier, seeking opportunity and security. Like many elderly immigrants, she maintained traditions from her homeland while adapting to a new culture. Her home reflected a lifetime of resilience. Neighbors knew her. People recognized her face. She was not anonymous. None of the victims were. They existed within communities that suddenly found themselves grieving. The murders were no longer isolated tragedies. They were becoming collective trauma. Each new death rippled outward through families, neighborhoods, churches, and workplaces. People who had never met the victims still felt connected to the fear their deaths created. And still the attacks continued. Jane Sullivan, 67 years old. Another woman living independently. Another life abruptly ended. Another crime scene that detectives desperately hoped would provide the breakthrough they needed. By now, Boston was changing. The atmosphere inside the city had shifted. Women who previously opened their doors without hesitation now paused before turning the handle. Apartment residents questioned unfamiliar visitors. Friends warned one another to be careful. Family members made extra telephone calls simply to ensure loved ones were safe. Fear had become part of daily life. Yet even as fear spread, no one knew that some of the most haunting chapters of the story were still ahead. Because eventually, the age pattern changed dramatically. And that change would create even greater confusion. One of the most significant victims in the case was Sophie Clark. Only 20 years old. Unlike many of the earlier victims, Sophie represented youth. Possibility. The beginning of adulthood rather than its later years. Born in Nova Scotia, Canada, she had moved to Boston and was studying while working toward her future. Her life contained ambitions. Goals. Dreams that extended decades into the future. Friends remembered her energy and optimism. The contrast between Sophie and many of the earlier victims was impossible to ignore. How could the same offender target both elderly women and a young student? The question troubled investigators. Criminal behavior often follows recognizable patterns. But this pattern seemed unusually broad. Either the offender possessed an uncommon level of flexibility in victim selection, or investigators were confronting a more complicated reality than they initially believed. Sophie's death became one of the most discussed murders in the entire case. Not only because of her age, but because certain details surrounding the crime would later play a crucial role in the investigation. Then came Patricia Bissett. 23 years old. Young. Independent. Working as a physical therapist. Her future appeared bright. Those who knew her described a woman dedicated to helping others. Someone building a meaningful life through education and professional achievement. Her murder sent another wave of shock through the city. Young women saw themselves reflected in Patricia. Suddenly the threat felt even more immediate. The earlier victims had largely been older women. Now younger residents realized they were not immune. No one was. Mary Brown followed. 69 years old. Another life lost. Another grieving family. Another funeral. Another set of unanswered questions. The investigation continued expanding, but progress remained painfully slow. Every victim increased pressure on law enforcement. Every victim intensified media scrutiny. Every victim deepened public fear. Then something happened that would provide investigators with a rare and valuable opportunity. A woman survived. Her name was Beverly Salmons. 23 years old. A gifted graduate student studying speech pathology. In June 1964, someone entered her apartment and attacked her with extraordinary violence. She was beaten. Stabbed. Left for dead. But she survived. Unlike the murdered victims, Beverly could provide information. Fragments of memory. Details about the attack. Observations that might help investigators understand who they were hunting. Survivors occupy a unique place in true crime history. They become witnesses to horrors most people cannot imagine. Their testimony often serves as a bridge between the living and the dead. Beverly's survival offered investigators something they desperately needed. Hope. Perhaps not enough to solve the case immediately, but enough to suggest that the killer was not entirely invisible. The next names added to the list would further cement the legend of the Boston Strangler. Evelyn Corbin. 58 years old. A woman known by friends as warm and dependable. Another victim whose life had been built through years of ordinary effort and perseverance. Then Joan Graff. Only 23. A schoolteacher. Young, educated, and respected. The type of person entrusted with shaping children's futures. Her murder shocked the public. Teachers, students, and parents across Boston felt the impact. The randomness appeared unbearable. And finally, there was Mary Sullivan. 19 years old. The youngest commonly recognized victim. Beautiful. Ambitious. Full of life. She had recently moved into her apartment and was beginning an exciting new chapter. Family members remembered her laughter. Friends remembered her kindness. She represented possibility in its purest form. A future not yet written. A life just beginning. When Mary Sullivan was murdered in January 1964, few people realized her case would remain central to the mystery for decades. Years later, advances in DNA technology would connect Albert DeSalvo to her murder with a level of scientific certainty unavailable to investigators during the original investigation. But in 1964, that future remained unimaginable. At the time, Mary was simply another victim. Another family shattered by grief. Another reminder that the killer remained free. Looking back today, the victims collectively reveal something powerful about the Boston Strangler case. They were not united by wealth. Not united by occupation. Not united by age. Not united by lifestyle. The youngest was 19. The oldest was 85. Some were immigrants. Some were lifelong Americans. Some were students. Some were retirees. Some were professionals. Some lived quiet, private lives. Yet every one of them possessed something the killer exploited. Trust. A belief that the world outside their door was not immediately dangerous. A belief that ordinary interactions remained safe. A belief shared by millions of people every day. That trust became the invisible thread connecting their stories. And as investigators struggled to understand the predator responsible, the city of Boston continued descending into fear. More victims had fallen. More families had been devastated. More questions remained unanswered. The names were accumulating. The pressure was building. The killer remained unidentified. And somewhere within the growing list of victims and crime scenes lay the clues that would eventually trigger one of the most controversial criminal investigations in American history. The moment a murder becomes a headline, the public usually sees only the ending. A body is discovered. Police arrive. An investigation begins. The victim's photograph appears in the news. But hidden behind every headline is a sequence of moments that no one witnesses completely. Moments measured in seconds. Moments during which an ordinary day transforms into a nightmare. Moments that investigators spend years trying to reconstruct. The story of the Boston Strangler is ultimately a story built from those missing moments. Because no one stood inside those apartments and watched what happened. No cameras recorded the attacks. No witnesses observed the murders from beginning to end. What remained were fragments. Crime scenes. Forensic evidence. Autopsy reports. Witness statements. And the haunting silence left behind by victims who could no longer tell their stories. To understand the horror that gripped Boston between 1962 and 1964, we must step inside those final hours not to sensationalize them, but to understand why these crimes terrified an entire city. The attacks associated with the Boston Strangler shared one deeply unsettling characteristic. Many occurred in places where victims should have been safest. Their homes. Not dark parking lots. Not isolated roads. Not abandoned buildings. Apartments. Bedrooms. Living rooms. Private spaces protected by locks and familiarity. That fact alone transformed public fear into something much more personal. A stranger on a dark street is frightening. A killer who can enter your home is something else entirely. Investigators quickly became convinced that the offender possessed an unusual ability to gain trust. Again and again, they encountered crime scenes with little indication of forced entry. Doors remained intact. Windows showed no signs of tampering. Locks appeared untouched. The implication was terrifying. The victims had likely opened the door themselves. Imagine a typical afternoon in Boston during the summer of 1962. The city hums with ordinary activity. Cars move through busy intersections. Children play outside. Laundry hangs from apartment windows. Somewhere, a woman washes dishes after lunch. She hears a knock. Nothing about the sound seems unusual. Perhaps she expects a neighbor. Perhaps a maintenance worker. Perhaps a delivery. She walks to the door, opens it, and unknowingly invites a predator inside. What happened next varied from case to case. But investigators believed many attacks followed a similar progression. The offender would initially appear calm, controlled, non-threatening, someone capable of putting victims at ease. The absence of immediate struggle in certain cases suggested conversations may have occurred before violence erupted. A few minutes. Perhaps less. Enough time to lower defenses. Enough time to close the door behind him. Enough time to trap the victim inside her own home. Then something changed. The mask disappeared. The friendly stranger became something else. Something dangerous. Something capable of extraordinary violence. One of the most chilling aspects of the murders was the contrast between the apparent normality of the entry and the brutality that followed. The transition from trust to terror could have occurred in seconds. A conversation interrupted by a sudden attack. A smile replaced by aggression. A routine interaction transformed into a fight for survival. Victims often had little opportunity to defend themselves. Some were elderly. Others were caught completely by surprise. Several crime scenes revealed evidence of desperate struggles. Furniture overturned. Personal belongings scattered. Signs that victims fought to stay alive. Those details reveal something important. The women were not passive participants in their fate. They resisted. They fought. They struggled against overwhelming violence. Their final moments were acts of survival. Acts of courage. Acts that deserve to be remembered. As detectives analyzed the murders, certain patterns emerged. Strangulation appeared repeatedly. This method of killing profoundly disturbed investigators. Unlike firearms, strangulation requires proximity, contact, time. It forces the offender into direct physical interaction with the victim. Many criminal psychologists later pointed to this detail as evidence of a deeply personal form of violence. A need for control. A desire for domination. A fixation extending beyond the act of killing itself. The killer's actions suggested someone seeking power over another human being. Someone deriving satisfaction not merely from death, but from the process of creating fear and helplessness. That possibility made the crimes even more frightening. Because it implied calculation, intent, purpose. These were not random explosions of anger. They appeared deliberate, methodical, predatory. As the attacks continued, another disturbing detail emerged. Several victims were discovered in positions that seemed intentionally arranged. Investigators struggled to understand the significance. Some bodies appeared posed after death. Certain items of clothing were manipulated in unusual ways. At one crime scene, a stocking had been tied into a bow-like shape and placed around the victim's neck. The image shocked even experienced detectives. Why would a killer take the time to do this? What did it mean? Was it a signature? A message? A ritual? Or simply another expression of psychological disturbance? No one knew. But such details reinforced the belief that investigators were dealing with an offender whose motivations extended beyond murder alone. Someone who wanted to leave something behind. Something memorable. Something symbolic. The uncertainty surrounding those details fueled public fascination and fear. Newspapers eagerly reported unusual elements from crime scenes. Readers consumed every revelation. Rumors spread rapidly. Some exaggerated reality. Others invented entirely new stories. In the absence of facts, speculation flourished. And speculation often proved more frightening than truth. One of the most tragic examples involved the murder of Sophie Clark. At only 20 years old, she represented a dramatic shift in the victim profile. Unlike several earlier victims, Sophie was young, active, and physically capable. Yet she too became a target. Her death suggested the offender's confidence was growing. The killer no longer appeared limited by age or vulnerability. The boundaries were expanding. For Boston residents, that realization was devastating. If elderly women were victims, one could argue that physical frailty played a role. But when young women began appearing among the dead, the illusion of safety collapsed further. Anyone could be next. Students, teachers, professionals, mothers, grandmothers. No category seemed immune. The attacks created an atmosphere unlike anything Boston had experienced in modern memory. Fear seeped into everyday decisions. Women hesitated before answering knocks at the door. Unexpected visitors triggered anxiety. Simple errands became sources of concern. Parents worried whenever daughters lived alone. Children worried about aging parents. The murders transformed ordinary life into a series of risk calculations. Can I answer the door? Can I trust this stranger? Should I stay home alone? Should I move in with family? Questions that previously seemed unnecessary suddenly became matters of personal safety. Meanwhile, the killer continued operating somewhere within the city. That fact haunted investigators. Every day without an arrest represented another opportunity. Another potential victim. Another family that might soon receive devastating news. Police worked relentlessly. Yet the offender seemed to vanish after each attack. No reliable witness. No clear suspect. No direct connection linking the victims. Only recurring violence. And mounting frustration. Perhaps one of the most disturbing aspects of the case is the possibility that the offender spent significant time observing victims beforehand. Predators rarely act without preparation. They watch. They learn. They identify weaknesses. Many investigators believed the killer likely selected victims after studying their routines. Learning who lived alone. Learning who might open the door. Learning when neighbors would be absent. If true, that means some victims may have been watched for days or even weeks without ever realizing it. The thought is deeply unsettling. A stranger observing from a distance. Blending into the environment. Waiting. Not acting impulsively. Planning. Calculating. Choosing the right moment. That image would become central to public perceptions of the Boston Strangler. A predator hidden in plain sight. Someone capable of appearing completely ordinary. Someone neighbors might greet without suspicion. Someone who could walk past police officers and attract no attention whatsoever. As the murders accumulated, investigators increasingly feared the offender was becoming more confident. Successful criminals often grow bolder over time. Each escape reinforces the belief that they are untouchable. Each unsolved crime strengthens their sense of control. The Boston murders seemed to reflect that progression. The attacks continued despite enormous publicity. Despite growing police presence. Despite widespread fear. The killer appeared undeterred. And that raised troubling questions. Was he following news coverage? Was he enjoying the attention? Did he view the investigation as a challenge? Or was he simply driven by compulsions beyond his ability to control? Again, answers remained elusive. The crimes themselves offered clues. But clues are not explanations. A crime scene can reveal what happened. Understanding why is often far more difficult. By late 1963 and early 1964, Boston had become a city under psychological siege. Women carried fear into grocery stores, into workplaces, into apartment buildings, into bed each night. The killer's greatest weapon was no longer physical violence alone. It was uncertainty. The possibility that another attack could happen at any moment. Anywhere. To anyone. And while the public struggled with fear, detectives faced an even more immediate burden. They knew the murders would continue unless the offender was stopped. Every unsolved case represented a failure measured in human lives. Every delay carried consequences. Some investigators worked to exhaustion. Others pursued leads that eventually collapsed. Pressure mounted from city officials, journalists, and frightened residents demanding answers. Yet despite thousands of investigative hours, the identity of the killer remained hidden. The attacks themselves had become the central mystery. How was he gaining access? Why these victims? How was he avoiding detection? What did he truly want? Those questions echoed through police stations across Boston. And somewhere, the man who may have held the answers continued moving through everyday life. Perhaps he read newspaper articles about the murders. Perhaps he listened to radio broadcasts discussing the investigation. Perhaps he watched the fear spreading through the city and felt a sense of power. No one can know for certain. What we do know is this. By the time the final victim associated with the Boston Strangler was killed, 13 women had lost their lives. Families had been shattered. Communities had been traumatized. An entire city had been transformed. And despite all the attention, all the fear, and all the investigative effort, the most important question remained unanswered. Who was responsible? The horror had unfolded. The victims were gone. The city was terrified. Now investigators faced the daunting task of piecing together the fragments left behind and hunting a killer who seemed determined to remain invisible. When detectives arrive at a homicide scene, they are not simply entering a room. They are stepping into the final chapter of someone's life. Every object becomes a potential witness. Every misplaced item becomes a possible clue. Every stain, every fingerprint, every disturbed piece of furniture tells part of a story that investigators must reconstruct without ever having seen the events themselves. The challenge is enormous. The victim cannot speak. The killer is gone. Only silence remains. For the investigators assigned to what would eventually become known as the Boston Strangler murders, that silence became both their greatest enemy and their greatest source of information. Because despite the horror of the crimes, the scenes themselves revealed patterns. Patterns that slowly convinced police they were not dealing with isolated killings. They were confronting something far more dangerous. The discovery of Anna Sleezers on June 14, 1962, marked the beginning. When family members became concerned and entered her apartment on Gainsborough Street, they expected to find a loved one. Instead, they found a nightmare. The shock was immediate. The apartment showed signs that something terrible had occurred. Anna's body revealed evidence of sexual assault and strangulation. For detectives, the scene raised dozens of questions. Who had entered the apartment? How had they gained access? What relationship, if any, existed between victim and attacker? The absence of obvious forced entry stood out almost immediately. Experienced investigators understood the significance. Most burglars leave traces. Broken locks. Damaged doors. Forced windows. Yet none of those indicators appeared prominent. It suggested a possibility that would become increasingly important as more murders occurred. Anna may have opened the door voluntarily. At first, that detail seemed merely noteworthy. Later, it would become one of the defining characteristics of the entire investigation. As additional victims were discovered over the following months, detectives began noticing disturbing similarities. Every homicide scene possessed unique elements. No two murders were identical. But certain recurring features appeared often enough to attract attention. Strangulation. Women living alone. Private residences. Limited evidence of forced entry. The pattern grew stronger with every case. And with every case, the pressure on investigators increased. The discovery of Mary Mullen intensified those concerns. At 85 years old, she was among the oldest victims. The crime scene displayed enough similarities to Anna's murder that detectives could no longer ignore the possibility of a connection. What initially appeared to be separate tragedies was beginning to resemble a series. And a series implied something terrifying. A repeat offender. A killer still at large. The challenge facing investigators in the early 1960s was dramatically different from what modern detectives experience today. There was no DNA analysis. No national computerized databases. No mobile phone records. No internet searches. No advanced surveillance footage collected from thousands of cameras. Crime scene investigation depended heavily on observation, physical evidence, witness interviews, and painstaking detective work. A fingerprint might become crucial. A witness statement might break the case. A single overlooked detail might determine success or failure. Every scene mattered. Every clue mattered. Yet the Boston murders repeatedly frustrated investigators because the offender appeared remarkably effective at avoiding detection. Fingerprints were collected. Fibers were examined. Photographs documented every inch of the scenes. But certainty remained elusive. The evidence rarely pointed clearly toward a specific individual. Instead, detectives found themselves assembling fragments. Fragments that suggested a pattern but failed to identify a suspect. As more victims were discovered, investigators became increasingly focused on understanding the killer's behavior. Criminal profiling as we know it today was still in its infancy. However, experienced detectives naturally searched for behavioral patterns. And several aspects of the murders stood out. First, the offender seemed comfortable entering victims' homes. That suggested confidence. Perhaps experience. Perhaps a personality capable of appearing trustworthy. Second, the crimes often occurred without attracting immediate attention. Neighbors rarely reported hearing prolonged disturbances. This implied either rapid attacks or an offender skilled at controlling victims before significant resistance could occur. Third, the scenes frequently revealed elements extending beyond simple murder. Some victims appeared to have been deliberately arranged after death. Certain details seemed almost theatrical. As if the killer wanted investigators to notice something. But what? That question lingered over the investigation like a cloud. One crime scene in particular left a lasting impression on detectives. Several victims were discovered with articles of clothing tied around their necks in unusual configurations. The infamous bow-like arrangement found in some cases became one of the most recognizable details associated with the murders. To investigators, it felt intentional. Not necessary for the killing itself. Intentional. That distinction mattered. Because intentional actions often reveal psychology. They reveal priorities. They reveal obsessions. The bow-like knot suggested the killer may have derived satisfaction from leaving a symbolic signature. If true, it meant investigators were confronting someone whose motivations extended beyond practical criminal objectives. This was not robbery. This was not a crime of financial gain. Something deeper was driving the violence. Meanwhile, detectives spent countless hours interviewing witnesses, neighbors, friends, family members, building employees, anyone who might have seen something unusual. The process was exhausting and often disappointing. Human memory is imperfect. Witnesses forget details. Timelines blur. Descriptions conflict. One person recalls a tall man. Another remembers someone shorter. One witness notices dark hair. Another describes light hair. The investigation became a maze of contradictions. Still, detectives persisted. Because occasionally, a useful detail emerged. Several witnesses reported seeing unfamiliar men near victim residences before attacks occurred. Some described individuals claiming to be repairmen. Others mentioned survey workers. A few recalled strangers asking questions. None of the reports were definitive. But together they hinted at a possibility. Perhaps the killer was using deception to gain access. Perhaps charm and confidence served as weapons long before physical violence began. That theory would become increasingly important in later years. As the body count grew, authorities established larger investigative efforts. Information sharing improved. Detectives compared reports from different jurisdictions. Investigators who might normally work independently began collaborating. The scale of the investigation expanded dramatically. The public demanded results. The media demanded results. Political leaders demanded results. Yet despite the growing resources devoted to the case, progress remained frustratingly limited. Every crime scene seemed to provide clues. Yet none provided enough. It was like assembling a 1,000-piece puzzle while half the pieces remained missing. Then investigators encountered something both encouraging and troubling. A survivor. Beverly Salmons. Her case differed significantly from many of the murders. In June 1964, Beverly suffered a brutal attack but managed to survive. For detectives, survivors are invaluable. Crime scenes tell stories. Survivors tell investigators what happened inside those stories. Beverly's account provided rare insight into the offender's methods. Though her injuries were severe, her survival offered investigators something they desperately needed. A living witness. Someone capable of describing the encounter. Someone capable of helping reconstruct the attack. Her testimony reinforced existing suspicions regarding how the offender approached victims. It strengthened theories involving deception and trust. And it reminded investigators that behind every crime scene lay moments of human interaction preceding the violence. Those moments mattered. Because understanding them might reveal the killer. Despite Beverly's survival, however, the broader mystery remained unsolved. The forensic evidence continued frustrating detectives. The limitations of 1960s technology became increasingly apparent. Today, a single DNA sample can transform an investigation. Back then, many forms of biological evidence had limited value. Investigators collected what they could, preserved what they could, analyzed what they could. But scientific tools simply had not yet caught up with criminal ingenuity. This reality would haunt the case for decades. Because evidence collected during those years would eventually become significant again. Very significant. But no one knew that yet. At the time, detectives could only work with the resources available. And those resources were proving insufficient. Another challenge involved media coverage. While publicity generated tips, it also created complications. False leads multiplied. Rumors spread rapidly. Some individuals falsely claimed knowledge of the crimes. Others inserted themselves into the investigation seeking attention. Each claim required evaluation. Each lead consumed time. Many led nowhere. Investigators found themselves drowning in information while starving for certainty. As months passed, another realization emerged. The offender appeared adaptable. The victim ages varied dramatically. The circumstances varied. Certain details differed from scene to scene. This adaptability complicated efforts to build a clear profile. Was one offender responsible? Or were multiple killers being grouped together? The question surfaced repeatedly, even among law enforcement officials. Not everyone agreed. Some detectives believed the similarities were too strong to ignore. Others argued the differences were equally important. That debate would continue for decades. And it remains unresolved even today. One particularly haunting aspect of the investigation involved the emotional toll on those working the case. Detectives are trained professionals. They witness tragedy regularly. But repeated exposure to violent crime leaves marks. Investigators reviewed photographs of victims, spoke with grieving families, attended briefings discussing new murders, then returned to work knowing another victim might already be in danger. The pressure was relentless. Failure carried human consequences. Every unsolved homicide represented someone lost. Someone whose family deserved answers. Someone whose killer remained free. As 1964 progressed, frustration grew throughout law enforcement. Years had passed since the first murder. Millions of dollars and countless investigative hours had been invested. Yet the offender remained unidentified. The city continued living under the shadow of fear. And then, unexpectedly, events began moving in a new direction. Not because of a crime scene. Not because of a witness. Not because of a breakthrough piece of forensic evidence. But because a man already in police custody for unrelated sexual offenses would begin making extraordinary claims. Claims that would shock investigators. Claims that would dominate headlines. Claims that seemed capable of solving the mystery. Or perhaps making it even more complicated. His name was Albert DeSalvo. And before long, he would place himself at the center of one of the most controversial criminal investigations in American history. By the summer of 1964, the Boston Strangler investigation had become something few criminal cases ever reach. It was no longer simply a murder investigation. It was a public obsession. A source of fear discussed at dinner tables, in barbershops, on college campuses, and in police stations throughout New England. Every new lead generated hope. Every failed lead generated frustration. And after more than 2 years of violence, investigators found themselves trapped in a cycle that seemed impossible to escape. They had victims. They had crime scenes. They had theories. What they did not have was a suspect they could prove was responsible. As public pressure mounted, detectives expanded their search in every conceivable direction. The list of possible suspects grew enormous. Thousands of names were reviewed. Countless interviews were conducted. Police chased leads across neighborhoods, cities, and even state lines. Some theories appeared promising for a few days before collapsing completely. Others survived for months before evidence disproved them. The investigation became a labyrinth of possibilities. And somewhere inside that labyrinth, the truth remained hidden. One of the earliest challenges involved the apparent contradictions between the victims themselves. The age range alone created confusion. Most serial predators focus on a specific type of victim. Certain physical characteristics. Certain lifestyles. Certain vulnerabilities. But the women connected to the Boston Strangler murders ranged from 19 to 85 years old. That inconsistency caused serious disagreement among investigators. Some believed the offender was simply opportunistic. Others suspected the police were trying to connect murders that should never have been grouped together. The question seemed simple. Were all 13 women killed by the same person? Yet the answer proved maddeningly difficult. Detectives spread photographs of victims across conference tables. They compared autopsy reports. They analyzed crime scene photographs. They searched for hidden connections. The similarities were undeniable. But so were the differences. Every conclusion seemed to create a new problem. The uncertainty slowed progress. And as investigators debated theories, fear continued spreading through Boston. Women altered their daily routines. Many refused to answer doors unless visitors were expected. Hardware stores sold increasing numbers of locks and security devices. Apartment managers received requests for stronger security measures. Some women temporarily moved in with relatives rather than live alone. The psychological impact reached far beyond the victims' families. The killer had succeeded in doing something many criminals never achieve. He had changed the behavior of an entire city. Meanwhile, detectives focused heavily on understanding how the offender gained access to victims' homes. This question became one of the most important aspects of the investigation. Again and again, crime scenes showed little evidence of forced entry. The implication was chilling. The victims likely allowed the offender inside voluntarily. But why? How? What kind of man could repeatedly convince strangers to trust him? Investigators began exploring a variety of possibilities. Perhaps the killer posed as a maintenance worker. Perhaps he impersonated utility personnel. Perhaps he pretended to be conducting surveys. Perhaps he simply possessed extraordinary charm and confidence. The theory of deception gained traction because it explained one critical mystery. If the victims believed the visitor was legitimate, they would have little reason to resist initially. The attack could begin before they recognized the danger. Yet theories alone could not solve the case. Police needed names, faces, evidence. And unfortunately, those remained elusive. Witnesses complicated matters further. Some reported seeing suspicious men near victim residences. Others described strangers knocking on doors in nearby neighborhoods. Sketch artists attempted to create composite images based on witness accounts. The results were frustrating. Descriptions varied dramatically. One witness described a stocky man. Another recalled someone slender. Some reported dark hair. Others remembered lighter features. Certain witnesses believed the man appeared middle-aged. Others estimated a younger age. The inconsistencies created confusion rather than clarity. Investigators could not determine whether witnesses were describing the same person or several different individuals. Every new description seemed to point in a different direction. Then came the flood of tips. Whenever a major criminal case dominates headlines, the public inevitably becomes part of the investigation. People begin noticing suspicious behavior everywhere. Neighbors report strange encounters. Co-workers mention unusual comments. Family members express concerns about relatives. Some tips prove useful. Most do not. The Boston Strangler investigation generated thousands. Police departments received phone calls at all hours. Letters arrived daily. Citizens reported men they considered suspicious. Ex-boyfriends. Former co-workers. Neighbors. Traveling salesmen. Repair workers. Virtually anyone who behaved oddly risked becoming the subject of scrutiny. Detectives followed countless leads. Many consumed days or weeks of investigative effort. Most ended in disappointment. The sheer volume of information became overwhelming. Finding genuine clues among thousands of false leads felt like searching for a single grain of sand on a beach. At the same time, investigators explored the possibility that a known criminal might be responsible. Boston's law enforcement agencies maintained files on burglars, rapists, violent offenders, and repeat criminals. Detectives systematically reviewed records. interviewed former suspects, re-examined unsolved cases, compared criminal histories. The hope was simple. Perhaps the killer had already attracted police attention in another context. Perhaps the answer was sitting inside a filing cabinet. But again, no clear suspect emerged. One name would occasionally surface, then disappear. Another would attract attention before being eliminated. The cycle repeated endlessly. As months turned into years, morale suffered. Not because detectives lacked determination, but because every apparent breakthrough eventually dissolved. One particularly troubling possibility began gaining support among certain investigators. Maybe there wasn't a single Boston Strangler. Maybe there were multiple killers. The theory was controversial, yet it addressed several troubling inconsistencies. The victims varied widely in age. Certain crime scene details differed significantly. Methods sometimes appeared inconsistent. Witness descriptions often conflicted. Could several unrelated murders have been grouped together because of superficial similarities? Some detectives believed so. Others disagreed strongly. They argued that the recurring patterns were too distinctive to ignore. The debate became one of the defining tensions within the investigation. And remarkably, that debate still exists today. Even modern experts remain divided. But during the early 1960s, the disagreement created practical challenges. If investigators could not agree on the nature of the threat, how could they effectively identify the offender? The uncertainty slowed progress. It created competing theories, competing priorities, competing suspects. Meanwhile, another category of suspects demanded attention: sex offenders. Because many victims showed evidence of sexual assault, detectives naturally focused on individuals with histories of sexual crimes. The list was extensive. Boston was a major city. Its criminal population included numerous offenders whose backgrounds warranted scrutiny. Investigators interviewed known rapists, reviewed parole records, monitored recently released offenders, examined patterns of behavior. Still nothing. The killer remained invisible. As frustration grew, newspapers intensified their coverage. Headlines became increasingly dramatic. Journalists analyzed every development. Television broadcasts discussed theories and suspects. The public consumed every update. The media attention created enormous pressure on law enforcement. Police officials faced criticism from frightened citizens demanding answers. Political leaders sought reassurance. Families of victims wanted justice. Everyone expected progress. Yet progress remained elusive. Then, amid the chaos, another disturbing development occurred. Certain individuals began falsely confessing. This phenomenon is more common than many people realize. High-profile crimes often attract people seeking attention, notoriety, or psychological gratification. The Boston Strangler case was no exception. Several individuals claimed responsibility. Investigators examined their statements carefully. Most quickly fell apart under scrutiny. Details were incorrect. Timelines failed to match. Facts were inconsistent. The confessions proved worthless. But they consumed valuable investigative resources. Each one had to be evaluated thoroughly before being dismissed. The process further complicated an already overwhelming case. By late 1964, the investigation seemed trapped. Police possessed mountains of information. Thousands of interviews. Hundreds of reports. Dozens of theories. Yet none provided the breakthrough everyone desperately wanted. Then attention began focusing on a man who, at first glance, seemed unrelated to the murders. His name was Albert Henry DeSalvo. Born in 1931, DeSalvo had accumulated a troubling history involving sexual offenses and predatory behavior. He was not a murderer in the eyes of the law. At least not yet. But he was already known to authorities. Particularly because of a disturbing pattern. He often gained access to women by pretending to be someone else. One of his most infamous schemes earned him a nickname, the Measuring Man. According to reports, DeSalvo would approach women claiming to conduct surveys or measurements for modeling agencies. Using charm, confidence, and deception, he persuaded victims to allow him into their homes. Once inside, his behavior frequently turned sexual and threatening. When investigators learned about these tactics, their attention sharpened immediately. The similarities were impossible to ignore. A man skilled at deception. A man comfortable entering women's homes. A man with a history of sexual offenses. For detectives exhausted by years of frustration, the possibility felt significant. Still, suspicion is not proof. Many offenders share similar traits. Police needed more than coincidence. They needed evidence. At the time, DeSalvo was already in custody for unrelated crimes. Then something unexpected happened. While incarcerated, he began speaking about the Boston Strangler murders. Not casually. Not vaguely. In remarkable detail. Details that immediately caught investigators' attention. Information that seemed impossible for an ordinary observer to know. As word spread through law enforcement circles, excitement grew. Could this finally be the breakthrough? Had investigators finally found the man responsible? Or were they about to enter an even more confusing chapter of the mystery? Because while DeSalvo's statements appeared compelling, they would soon create as many questions as answers. Questions about truth. Questions about memory. Questions about evidence. Questions that would divide investigators, journalists, criminologists, and the public for decades. The hunt for suspects had finally produced a name. But whether that name truly belonged to the Boston Strangler remained one of the most controversial questions in criminal history. And in the months ahead, Albert DeSalvo would move from obscurity to the center of a case that still refuses to surrender all of its secrets. For more than 2 years, the Boston Strangler investigation had felt like a ship drifting through thick fog. Detectives could hear the danger around them. They could see fragments of evidence floating in the darkness. But they could not find the source. Every lead seemed promising until it vanished. Every suspect appeared plausible until the facts unraveled. The public demanded answers. The families demanded justice. And investigators were running out of options. Then, suddenly, a name emerged from a place no one expected. Albert Henry DeSalvo. At first, there was nothing particularly extraordinary about the discovery. Police had encountered hundreds of criminals during the investigation. Thousands of names had crossed investigators' desks. Many possessed violent histories. Many had records involving sexual offenses. Yet DeSalvo stood out for one important reason. He possessed a very specific talent. A talent that seemed disturbingly compatible with the murders. He knew how to gain access. Long before anyone connected him to the Boston Strangler case, DeSalvo had already demonstrated a pattern of deception. He often approached women while pretending to be someone else. A survey worker. A representative from a modeling agency. A professional conducting measurements. His victims frequently described him as polite, confident, and surprisingly persuasive. That ability mattered. Because one of the greatest mysteries surrounding the Boston murders involved entry. Again and again, investigators encountered apartments showing little evidence of forced access. The victims appeared to have opened their doors willingly. For years, detectives had asked themselves the same question. Who could repeatedly convince strangers to let him inside? Now they had a possible answer. A man whose criminal history suggested exactly that kind of behavior. Still, similarities alone could not solve a murder case. Investigators needed something stronger. Something concrete. Something that would connect DeSalvo directly to the crimes. Then events took an unexpected turn. While incarcerated for unrelated offenses, DeSalvo began speaking about the murders. Not just one murder. All of them. The claim stunned investigators. Serial murder cases occasionally generate false confessions. People seek attention. Fame. Psychological gratification. But what happened next was different. As detectives listened to DeSalvo describe the crimes, they noticed something unsettling. He knew details. Very specific details. Certain pieces of information had never been released publicly. Yet DeSalvo appeared familiar with them. Investigators leaned forward. Questions became sharper. Interviews became longer. Every statement was scrutinized. And with each conversation, the possibility grew stronger. Perhaps the mystery was finally ending. The man sitting before them seemed capable of describing crime scenes with remarkable precision. He discussed victims, locations, methods, circumstances. Some detectives left those interviews convinced they had finally found their killer. Others remained cautious. Experience had taught them that confidence and truth are not always the same thing. Nevertheless, the impact was immediate. For the first time, investigators possessed a suspect who appeared connected to the crimes in a meaningful way. The breakthrough electrified the investigation. Word spread rapidly through law enforcement circles. Then it reached the media. Soon, newspapers across America carried stories linking Albert DeSalvo to the Boston Strangler murders. For a frightened public, the development felt like a turning point. A face had finally emerged from the darkness. The invisible predator suddenly seemed real, tangible, human. Yet beneath the excitement, troubling questions remained. The first issue involved evidence. Specifically, the lack of it. Even though DeSalvo's confession contained compelling details, physical evidence linking him to many of the murders remained surprisingly limited. This created tension among investigators. Some believed the confession itself was powerful enough. Others argued that confessions alone should never be trusted completely. After all, criminal history contains numerous examples of false admissions. People confess for many reasons. Mental illness, attention, manipulation, misunderstanding, self-interest. A confession may appear convincing while still containing inaccuracies. As investigators dug deeper, they discovered reasons for concern. Certain witness descriptions did not match DeSalvo. Several women who had survived encounters with suspicious men recalled individuals whose appearances differed significantly from his. Height estimates varied. Facial features varied. Body types varied. The discrepancies were difficult to ignore. Were witnesses mistaken? Had memories faded? Or were they describing someone else entirely? The questions multiplied. Then came another problem. Fingerprints. At several crime scenes, fingerprint evidence either failed to implicate DeSalvo or raised additional uncertainty. Investigators found themselves confronting a strange contradiction. The suspect knew details he seemingly should not know. Yet certain forms of physical evidence did not point clearly toward him. The case was becoming more complicated rather than less. Still, DeSalvo continued talking. Hour after hour. Interview after interview. The volume of information he provided impressed many investigators. Some became convinced that no innocent person could possibly possess such knowledge. Others remained skeptical. Could DeSalvo have learned details indirectly? Could information have leaked through unofficial channels? Could conversations, media reports, or interactions with other inmates explain some of his knowledge? The debate intensified. Even among professionals working the case, consensus remained elusive. What should have been a moment of certainty instead became a battleground of competing interpretations. One group believed the mystery had effectively been solved. The other believed the mystery was merely changing shape. Then another key figure entered the story. A fellow inmate named George Nassar. Nassar was a convicted murderer with connections to organized crime and a reputation for manipulation. According to later accounts, DeSalvo allegedly confided in him regarding the Boston murders. Nassar then helped facilitate communication between DeSalvo and authorities. The relationship intrigued investigators. It also generated suspicion. Some wondered whether Nassar influenced the confession. Others questioned whether the two men exchanged information in ways that complicated the reliability of DeSalvo's statements. The more investigators examined the situation, the murkier it became. Yet despite these concerns, DeSalvo increasingly occupied the center of the investigation. Public perception began shifting. For many people, the case was already solved. The killer had confessed. The mystery was over. But investigators knew reality was rarely that simple. Behind closed doors, debates continued. Could one man truly have committed all 13 murders? The victim profiles varied dramatically. The crime scenes contained inconsistencies. Certain aspects of offender behavior seemed difficult to reconcile. Some detectives believed DeSalvo was responsible for every murder. Others suspected he had committed only some. A few believed entirely different offenders might have been involved. The uncertainty refused to disappear. Nevertheless, the investigation had undeniably reached its most significant turning point. For years, police had searched for a suspect. Now they had one. For years, they had struggled to understand how the killer operated. Now they possessed a man whose history seemed compatible with the crimes. For years, they had lacked a narrative connecting the murders. Now they had a confession. The breakthrough transformed the case. Yet perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the entire story is what happened next. Despite confessing to the murders, DeSalvo was never actually tried for them. The reason reveals just how complicated the situation had become. Prosecutors worried that the available evidence might not support murder convictions beyond a reasonable doubt. The confession appeared powerful. But confessions can be challenged. Physical evidence remained problematic. Witness testimony contained inconsistencies. The legal risks were significant. As a result, DeSalvo was prosecuted primarily for unrelated sexual offenses and crimes connected to his activities as the Measuring Man. He received a lengthy prison sentence. The public largely viewed him as the Boston Strangler. Yet legally, the situation remained far less definitive. This unusual outcome only fueled controversy. Critics questioned why a confessed serial killer was not being tried for murder. Supporters argued prosecutors were acting prudently. The debate spilled into newspapers, television programs, and public discussions. Years passed. Then decades. And still the questions lingered. Meanwhile, DeSalvo himself became an object of fascination. Journalists sought interviews. Criminologists studied his behavior. Authors wrote about the case. The legend of the Boston Strangler continued growing. Yet certainty remained elusive. Some investigators who originally believed in his guilt later expressed doubts. Others became even more convinced. The passage of time failed to resolve the disagreement. Then, in 1973, another shocking event occurred. Albert DeSalvo was murdered inside MCI Walpole Prison. He was only 42 years old. The circumstances surrounding his death generated new speculation. Rumors spread rapidly. Some suggested revenge. Others suggested silencing. Some imagined hidden secrets dying with him. No definitive explanation emerged. Once again, uncertainty became part of the story. And once again, the Boston Strangler mystery deepened. For many observers, DeSalvo's death felt like the end of the road. The primary suspect was gone. The investigation belonged to history. The remaining questions might never be answered. Yet history had one more surprise waiting. A surprise hidden within evidence collected decades earlier. A surprise made possible by scientific advances investigators in the 1960s could scarcely imagine. The confession had changed the direction of the case. It had provided a suspect. It had provided a narrative. But it had not provided certainty. True certainty would require something stronger than memory. Stronger than testimony. Stronger than confession. It would require science. And nearly half a century later, science would finally return to the case, forcing investigators to revisit one of the most famous criminal mysteries in American history. Justice is often imagined as a destination. A courtroom. A verdict. A judge reading a sentence. A door closing behind a convicted killer. The public likes endings that feel complete. A crime occurs. The police solve it. The guilty are punished. The victims receive justice. The story ends. But the Boston Strangler case refused to follow that script. In fact, one of the reasons it continues to fascinate criminologists, historians, and investigators more than half a century later is because the traditional ending never truly arrived. There was no dramatic murder trial in which prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence connecting Albert DeSalvo to all 13 victims. There was no moment when a jury unanimously declared him guilty of the Boston Strangler murders. There was no courtroom scene that neatly resolved every question. Instead, there was uncertainty. And uncertainty would become one of the defining characteristics of the case. By the mid-1960s, Albert DeSalvo had become the central figure in the investigation. His confession had convinced many people. Large portions of the public accepted him as the Boston Strangler. Many journalists accepted it. Many investigators accepted it. Even today, countless books and documentaries present the story as though the mystery was completely solved. But behind the headlines, legal reality was far more complicated. Prosecutors faced a difficult problem. They believed DeSalvo possessed knowledge that strongly suggested involvement in the murders. Yet belief alone could not secure convictions. American courts require evidence. Physical evidence. Witness testimony. Corroboration. Proof capable of surviving rigorous scrutiny. And despite years of investigation, that proof remained surprisingly limited. The confession itself presented challenges. Defense attorneys could argue that details had leaked. Information may have circulated through unofficial channels. Investigators may have unintentionally revealed facts during interviews. Witness memories remained imperfect. Crime scene evidence remained incomplete. Prosecutors understood the risk. If they charged DeSalvo with murder and failed to convince a jury, the consequences could be disastrous. As a result, a decision was made that would shape the legacy of the case forever. Rather than pursuing murder convictions immediately, authorities focused on crimes they believed could be proven more reliably. The sexual assaults. The attacks connected to his activities as the measuring man. The offenses for which stronger evidence existed. To many members of the public, the distinction seemed almost meaningless. They believed the Boston Strangler had been identified. They believed the danger had ended. Yet legally speaking, the situation remained unresolved. Albert DeSalvo was sentenced to prison. But not for the murders that had made him infamous. That fact alone remains astonishing. One of the most famous alleged serial killers in American history was never convicted of being the Boston Strangler. The contradiction puzzled observers then. It continues to puzzle them now. Inside prison, DeSalvo became an unusual figure. He attracted enormous attention. Reporters sought access. Researchers studied him. Criminal psychologists attempted to understand him. His confession transformed him into one of the most discussed inmates in the United States. Yet the controversy never disappeared. Some investigators remained convinced of his guilt. Others harbored doubts. Questions persisted. Why did certain witness descriptions differ from his appearance? Why did some physical evidence fail to align neatly with the confession? Why did aspects of the crimes seem inconsistent? Every answer appeared to generate another question. The debate followed DeSalvo throughout his incarceration. Then, on November 25, 1973, the story took another shocking turn. That morning, prison staff at MCI Walpole discovered Albert DeSalvo suffering from multiple stab wounds. The attack had occurred inside one of Massachusetts' most notorious correctional facilities. Despite efforts to save him, he died from his injuries. He was only 42 years old. News of his death spread quickly. Almost immediately, speculation exploded. Prison murders often generate rumors. High-profile inmates generate even more. And few inmates carried a reputation as infamous as Albert DeSalvo. Why had he been killed? Who ordered the attack? Was it personal revenge? Was it connected to criminal activity inside the prison? Had he angered the wrong people? Or was there some deeper motive hidden beneath the surface? Investigators examined the circumstances. Leads emerged. Suspects were considered. Yet, as with so many aspects of the Boston Strangler saga, certainty remained frustratingly elusive. The death of DeSalvo created a strange situation. If he truly was the Boston Strangler, then the principal suspect was gone forever. Any remaining secrets died with him. If he was not responsible for all the murders, then the truth might now be even harder to uncover. The mystery seemed destined to remain unresolved. Years passed. Then decades. Public interest faded somewhat, though it never disappeared entirely. New generations discovered the case through books and television programs. Criminal justice experts continued debating the evidence. Historians revisited old files. Retired detectives reflected on unanswered questions. And all the while, advances in forensic science transformed criminal investigations. Techniques unimaginable during the 1960s became routine. DNA profiling revolutionized law enforcement. Cold cases once considered hopeless suddenly became solvable. Investigators around the world reopened old files. Evidence that had sat untouched for decades acquired new significance. Eventually, attention returned to the Boston Strangler case. Specifically, to one victim. Mary Sullivan. The youngest victim commonly associated with the murders. 19 years old. Her death in January 1964 had haunted investigators for generations. Unlike many aspects of the case, physical evidence connected to her murder still existed. And modern scientists believed that evidence might finally answer questions that had lingered for nearly half a century. The process began with genetic analysis. Investigators compared DNA recovered from evidence associated with Mary Sullivan's murder to genetic material connected to relatives of Albert DeSalvo. The results were striking. The probability of a connection appeared extraordinarily strong. Encouraged by the findings, authorities took a dramatic step. DeSalvo's remains were exhumed. Modern forensic testing followed. For the first time, investigators could directly compare his DNA profile with evidence preserved from the crime scene. The results changed the conversation. The DNA matched. After decades of uncertainty, science established a powerful link between Albert DeSalvo and the murder of Mary Sullivan. For many observers, the finding felt like long-awaited confirmation. At least one murder had now been connected to him with compelling scientific evidence. The significance cannot be overstated. During the original investigation, detectives had relied largely on interviews, witness statements, and traditional forensic methods. Now science had provided something far stronger. Objective biological evidence. Evidence unavailable to investigators in the 1960s. Evidence capable of surviving scrutiny. Evidence capable of speaking decades after both victim and suspect were gone. Yet remarkably, even this breakthrough failed to resolve every controversy. Because while the DNA linked DeSalvo to Mary Sullivan's murder, it did not automatically prove responsibility for all 13 deaths. The central debate remained alive. Some experts argued that the DNA strengthened confidence in the confession overall. If DeSalvo murdered Mary Sullivan, perhaps he committed the others as well. Others remained cautious. They pointed out that one proven murder does not necessarily establish guilt for 12 additional crimes. The differences among the victims still existed. The inconsistencies still existed. The unanswered questions still existed. Once again, the Boston Strangler case resisted simplicity. It offered evidence, but not complete certainty. It offered answers, but not all of them. And so the legal story of the Boston Strangler became unlike almost any other major serial murder investigation in American history. No murder conviction. No definitive trial. A confession surrounded by controversy. A suspect murdered in prison. A DNA breakthrough arriving nearly 50 years later. The pursuit of justice stretched across generations. For the families of victims, the situation remained emotionally complex. Some believed the DNA findings finally validated what investigators had long suspected. Others continued questioning aspects of the official narrative. Many simply wished for peace after decades of uncertainty. The legal chapter had never produced the clean ending people expected. Instead, it delivered something more realistic. A mixture of truth and mystery, resolution and doubt, science and speculation. And perhaps that is why the case endures. Because justice, in the Boston Strangler story, was never a single moment. It was a long and winding process. A process that extended far beyond courtrooms and prison walls. A process that continued long after both the victims and the suspect were gone. Yet even after the DNA evidence, even after the investigations, even after decades of debate, one final question remained. What does this case ultimately mean? Not just for Boston. Not just for criminal justice. But for the way society remembers victims, understands fear, and confronts the uncomfortable reality that some mysteries never fully surrender their secrets. More than 60 years have passed since the first woman connected to the Boston Strangler murders lost her life. The streets of Boston have changed. Neighborhoods have evolved. Buildings have been renovated, demolished, and rebuilt. Generations have come and gone. The city that lived through the fear of the early 1960s is no longer the same city that exists today. Yet certain stories refuse to disappear. Certain names continue echoing through history. And few criminal cases have left a shadow quite like the Boston Strangler. When people hear that name today, many immediately think of a killer. A mystery. A confession. A controversy. A decades-long debate over guilt and innocence. But perhaps the most important lesson of this case is that it was never truly about the man at the center of the headlines. It was about the women whose lives were taken. The tragedy of famous criminal cases is that public memory often becomes distorted. The offender becomes larger than life. His face appears in documentaries. His name fills books. His psychology becomes the focus of endless analysis. Meanwhile, the victims slowly become footnotes. A list. A statistic. A collection of names attached to a case file. The Boston Strangler story challenges us to resist that tendency. Because behind every crime scene photograph stood a real person. A woman with routines, relationships, memories, fears, and dreams. Anna Sleezers survived war and displacement before seeking a peaceful life in America. Mary Mullen lived long enough to witness enormous changes in the world around her. Sophie Clark was only beginning adulthood. Patricia Bissett was building a career helping others. Joan Graff dedicated her life to education. Mary Sullivan was just 19 years old, standing at the threshold of a future she would never have the chance to experience. These women were not characters in a mystery. They were human beings. And their absence left wounds that extended far beyond newspaper headlines. Families lost mothers. Brothers lost sisters. Children lost parents. Friends lost people they expected to know for decades more. The grief created by murder does not end when newspapers stop printing stories. It lingers. Years become decades. Birthdays arrive. Holidays pass. Family gatherings continue with empty spaces that never truly disappear. For those closest to the victims, the Boston Strangler case was never an intellectual puzzle. It was personal loss. And perhaps that is the first lesson this story leaves behind. Every true crime case begins and ends with human lives. Everything else comes second. The investigation itself also offers important insights into the limitations of criminal justice. Modern audiences sometimes forget how different policing was during the early 1960s. Today, many people assume forensic science can solve almost anything. DNA testing, digital surveillance, mobile phone tracking, national databases, advanced laboratory analysis. These tools have transformed criminal investigations. But detectives working the Boston Strangler case possessed none of them. They relied on observation, interviews, fingerprints, physical evidence that often provided incomplete answers. Looking back, it is easy to criticize mistakes. It is easy to ask why investigators failed to solve the case sooner. Yet history reminds us that law enforcement officers were operating within the limitations of their era. The Boston Strangler investigation became a powerful example of both the strengths and weaknesses of 20th century policing. Thousands of hours of detective work generated valuable insights. At the same time, scientific limitations left critical questions unanswered. Questions that remained unresolved for decades. When DNA evidence finally linked Albert DeSalvo to the murder of Mary Sullivan, it demonstrated something remarkable. Evidence can outlive everyone involved. Technology changes. Methods improve. Truth sometimes waits patiently for science to catch up. Yet even the DNA breakthrough failed to answer every question. And that brings us to the mystery at the heart of the case. Was Albert DeSalvo truly the Boston Strangler? The answer depends partly on which question is being asked. Was he responsible for Mary Sullivan's murder? Modern DNA evidence strongly suggests yes. That conclusion is supported by scientific findings unavailable during the original investigation. But was he responsible for all 13 murders? That question remains far more complicated. Some investigators spent years convinced he was. Others remained skeptical until the end of their careers. Certain criminologists argue that the similarities among the crimes point toward a single offender. Others emphasize the differences. The varying victim profiles. The inconsistent witness descriptions. The differing crime scene details. The possibility that several offenders operated during the same period. Even today, experts continue debating the issue. Perhaps the most honest answer is that complete certainty remains elusive. History is often uncomfortable that way. We want definitive conclusions. Sometimes reality refuses to provide them. The Boston Strangler case reminds us that unresolved questions are not failures of history. They are part of history. Some mysteries survive because evidence disappears. Some survive because witnesses die. Some survive because human behavior is simply too complex to fit neatly into a single explanation. The uncertainty surrounding this case has become part of its legacy. Yet the story also reveals something profound about fear. When the murders began, Boston changed. Not physically. Psychologically. Women altered routines. Neighbors became suspicious of strangers. Doors remained locked. Trust became more difficult. The killer's greatest impact extended beyond the victims themselves. He reshaped how an entire city viewed safety. Fear is powerful because it spreads. One crime affects one victim. Fear affects thousands. The Boston Strangler murders demonstrated how quickly public confidence can erode when danger appears random and unpredictable. Yet the story also demonstrated resilience. Communities adapted. Families supported one another. Neighbors became more attentive. Law enforcement agencies improved cooperation. Citizens remained vigilant. The city endured. That resilience deserves recognition as well. Because history is not only a record of tragedy. It is also a record of survival. The families who lost loved ones continued living. The investigators who carried the burden of unsolved murders continued searching. The survivors continued rebuilding their lives. Boston itself continued moving forward. The nightmare eventually ended. The wounds remained. But life continued. Another important lesson emerges when examining Albert DeSalvo himself. Society often imagines evil as something obvious. Something easily recognized. We picture monsters who look different from everyone else. We expect warning signs visible from a distance. Reality is frequently more disturbing. Dangerous people often appear ordinary. They hold jobs. Maintain relationships. Engage in everyday activities. They blend into crowds. They earn trust. The Boston Strangler case forced people to confront that uncomfortable truth. If DeSalvo was responsible, then the man at the center of one of America's most infamous murder cases did not resemble a monster from fiction. He resembled a neighbor, a coworker, a stranger encountered on an ordinary afternoon. That realization remains unsettling because it challenges our assumptions about human nature. The case also highlights the role of media in shaping public perception. The nickname Boston Strangler became a cultural phenomenon. It transformed a series of murders into a national story. The label helped generate awareness. But it also simplified a complex reality. Nicknames create narratives. Narratives create assumptions. And assumptions sometimes survive long after evidence becomes uncertain. The tension between public storytelling and factual complexity remains relevant today. Modern true crime audiences continue wrestling with the same challenge. How do we tell compelling stories without losing sight of reality? How do we honor victims without glorifying offenders? How do we balance mystery with responsibility? The Boston Strangler case offers no simple answers. But it encourages those questions. And perhaps that is one reason the story continues attracting attention after so many decades. Not because people are fascinated by violence, but because the case touches deeper themes. Fear, trust, justice, uncertainty, human vulnerability, the search for truth. These themes transcend a single criminal investigation. They speak to universal experiences. They remind us that safety is fragile, that certainty is rare, that justice is often imperfect, and that some questions remain unanswered despite our best efforts. As we reach the end of this story, the image that remains is not a prison cell, not a confession, not a crime scene. It is a city that spent years looking over its shoulder, a city searching desperately for answers. A city forever changed by 13 names that became part of its history. The Boston Strangler may remain one of America's most debated criminal mysteries. Historians may continue arguing. Criminologists may continue publishing theories. New evidence may emerge. Or it may not. But regardless of how future generations interpret the case, one truth remains unchanged. The victims mattered. Their lives mattered. Their stories mattered. And remembering them, not the legend, not the nickname, not the mythology, is perhaps the closest thing to justice history can still provide. Because in the end, the most important question is not whether the mystery will ever be completely solved. The most important question is whether we remember the human beings at its center. And if we do, then the voices that violence tried to silence are not truly gone. They continue to be heard. They continue to be remembered. And they continue to remind us why the search for truth matters, even when certainty remains just beyond our reach. Years after the headlines faded, after the television cameras disappeared, and after the court records were archived, the Boston Strangler case remained alive in a place no investigation could fully reach. Memory. Not the memory preserved in police files. Not the memory stored in evidence boxes. But the memory carried by people. The families who never stopped wondering. The detectives who retired without complete certainty. The survivors who spent years trying to reclaim a sense of safety. And the city itself, which learned that some wounds do not disappear simply because time passes. For many of the investigators who worked the case, the Boston Strangler became the investigation that followed them long after their careers ended. Some would later sit for interviews and admit that certain questions still troubled them. Not because they lacked theories. Most had theories. Some firmly believed Albert DeSalvo was responsible for every murder. Others believed he committed only some of them. A few remained convinced that multiple killers operated during the same period. What haunted them was not the absence of opinions. It was the absence of certainty. Police officers spend their careers pursuing answers. The Boston Strangler case taught them that answers and certainty are not always the same thing. A person can be reasonably sure. A person can even be overwhelmingly convinced. Yet a small doubt may remain. A single unanswered question. A single inconsistency. A single detail that refuses to fit neatly into the larger picture. Those details linger. They survive long after official investigations conclude. For the families of the victims, however, the debate often felt secondary. Academic discussions about criminal profiling meant little compared to an empty chair at Thanksgiving. Arguments about forensic evidence meant little compared to birthdays that arrived without a mother, sister, daughter, or friend. The public often views notorious cases through the lens of mystery. Families experience them through the lens of absence. That distinction matters. Because behind every famous criminal investigation lies a simple reality. Someone did not come home. Someone's future vanished. Someone's loved ones were forced to continue living without answers they desperately wanted. Even after the DNA findings connected Albert DeSalvo to Mary Sullivan's murder, the emotional impact remained complex. For some, the discovery brought relief. At least one major question had finally received a scientific answer. For others, it reopened old wounds. If one answer emerged after nearly 50 years, what other answers might still be hidden? What evidence had been lost? What witnesses had died? What opportunities had vanished with time? History rarely provides second chances. And criminal investigations are no exception. As decades passed, the Boston Strangler story evolved beyond a single case. It became a lesson taught in criminal justice courses. A subject discussed by psychologists. A case study for forensic investigators. An example of how public fear can shape communities. An example of how technological limitations can affect justice. An example of how science can revisit questions once thought impossible to answer. Young detectives entering law enforcement today inherit tools investigators of the 1960s could scarcely imagine. DNA databases. Digital evidence. Surveillance systems. Advanced forensic laboratories. Yet the Boston Strangler case remains relevant because technology alone does not eliminate uncertainty. Evidence still requires interpretation. Witnesses still make mistakes. Human beings remain complicated. Truth remains difficult to uncover. Perhaps that is why the case continues attracting attention generation after generation. Not because it offers perfect answers, but because it does not. It forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality. Some mysteries survive. Some questions remain open. Some stories resist clean conclusions. And yet the search for truth continues anyway. There is something profoundly human about that persistence. The refusal to stop asking questions. The refusal to stop seeking understanding. The refusal to allow victims to disappear into history without remembrance. The Boston Strangler case may never achieve complete closure. Future discoveries may strengthen existing conclusions. They may challenge them. They may reveal entirely new perspectives. No one can know. But perhaps closure was never the true legacy of this story. Perhaps the legacy is vigilance. Perhaps the legacy is compassion for victims. Perhaps the legacy is the reminder that justice is often a process rather than a destination. And perhaps the greatest legacy is memory itself. Because every time the case is discussed, every time a victim's name is spoken, every time a new generation learns what happened in Boston between 1962 and 1964, the women at the center of the story are remembered once again. Their lives become more than crime scene photographs. More than newspaper articles. More than evidence files. They become human beings restored to the narrative. And that may be the most important ending any true crime story can offer. Not the ending of a mystery, but the preservation of memory. Long after the investigators are gone. Long after the suspect is gone. Long after the city has changed. The names remain. Anna Sleezers. Mary Mullen. Nina Nichols. Helen Blake. Ida Erger. Jane Sullivan. Sophie Clark. Patricia Bissett. Mary Brown. Beverly Salmons, who survived. Evelyn Corbin. Joan Graff. Mary Sullivan. A list of names that history could have reduced to statistics. A list of names that deserve to be remembered as lives. And as the final pages of the Boston Strangler story close, perhaps that is where our attention belongs. Not on the legend. Not on the mythology. Not even on the killer. But on the people whose stories began long before the murders and whose memory continues long after them. Because true crime is ultimately not about death. It is about the value of the lives that were lost. And those lives are worth remembering. If there is one final chapter to the Boston Strangler story, it exists not in a courtroom, not in a prison, and not in a police archive. It exists in the unanswered space between what we know and what we may never know. Most criminal cases move toward resolution. Evidence accumulates. Suspects are identified. Trials are conducted. Verdicts are delivered. History closes the file. The Boston Strangler case never completely followed that path. Instead, it became something far rarer. A case that appears solved to some people and unsolved to others. A case that occupies a strange territory between certainty and doubt. A case where every answer seems accompanied by another question. And perhaps that is why it continues to endure. Human beings are naturally drawn to mysteries. We seek patterns. We seek explanations. We seek conclusions. The idea that a major criminal case could remain partially unresolved for generations feels almost unacceptable. Yet history contains many examples of exactly that. The Boston Strangler remains one of the most famous. Even now, retired investigators, criminal psychologists, forensic experts, journalists, and historians continue examining the evidence. Old reports are revisited. Witness statements are analyzed. Timelines are reconstructed. Theories are debated. New documentaries appear. New books are published. The conversation never fully stops. What makes the debate so fascinating is that both sides possess compelling arguments. Those who believe Albert DeSalvo committed all the murders point toward the confession. They point toward the detailed knowledge he demonstrated. They point toward behavioral similarities between his known crimes and the methods used against the victims. They point toward the DNA evidence connecting him to Mary Sullivan. They argue that the simplest explanation is often the correct one. A single offender. A single predator. A single man responsible for the terror that gripped Boston. Yet those who remain skeptical raise equally important questions. Why were some witness descriptions so inconsistent? Why did certain crime scene details vary dramatically? Why did some investigators who worked the case firsthand express doubts? Why was DeSalvo never actually convicted of the murders themselves? Could multiple offenders have been operating simultaneously? Could a mixture of crimes have been combined into one narrative because the similarities appeared convincing? The debate remains alive because neither perspective can completely eliminate the other. And so the mystery survives. Not because no answers exist, but because complete certainty remains out of reach. In many ways, the Boston Strangler investigation became a bridge between two eras of criminal justice. One era relied heavily on traditional detective work. Interviews. Surveillance. Intuition. Informants. Human observation. The other relies increasingly on science. DNA. Digital evidence. Data analysis. Advanced forensic technology. The case stands at the intersection of those worlds. Detectives from the 1960s did everything possible with the tools available to them. Decades later, science revisited their work and provided answers they could never have obtained during their own careers. Yet even science encountered limits. DNA answered one question. It did not answer all of them. That reality offers an important lesson. Technology can reveal truth. But technology does not eliminate complexity. Human behavior remains complicated. Human memory remains imperfect. Human motivations remain difficult to understand. The Boston Strangler case reminds us that criminal investigations are rarely as straightforward as fictional stories suggest. Real life is messy. Evidence conflicts. Witnesses disagree. Conclusions evolve. What seems obvious in one decade may appear uncertain in the next. That uncertainty can be frustrating. But it can also be valuable. Because uncertainty encourages humility. It reminds us that justice systems are operated by human beings. Human beings make mistakes. Human beings possess biases. Human beings work within the limits of their knowledge. Acknowledging those realities does not weaken the pursuit of justice. It strengthens it. It encourages caution. It encourages careful investigation. It encourages the recognition that confidence and certainty are not always identical. Looking back, perhaps one of the most remarkable aspects of the Boston Strangler case is not the violence itself. It is the scale of its impact. Thousands of murders occur throughout history. Only a small number reshape an entire city. The Boston Strangler did exactly that. For several years, fear altered daily life throughout Boston. Women changed routines. Families changed habits. Neighborhoods changed behavior. The killer's reach extended far beyond the victims. Fear became contagious. It traveled through conversations, through headlines, through whispered warnings between friends, through the simple act of hearing a knock at the door. The psychological effect became part of the crime itself. Even residents who never encountered danger personally carried the burden of uncertainty. That impact remains one of the clearest examples of how serial crimes can transform communities. Yet there is another side to the story. Resilience. Because despite the fear, Boston endured. People adapted. Communities supported one another. Investigators continued working despite frustration and public pressure. Families continued living despite unimaginable grief. Life moved forward. Not because the pain disappeared, but because human beings possess an extraordinary ability to continue. The city survived. The families survived. The memory survived. And perhaps that is the final lesson. Evil often seeks control. It seeks domination. It seeks to leave lasting scars. But memory can become a form of resistance. Every time the victims are remembered, they reclaim part of the story. Every time their names are spoken, the focus shifts away from the offender and back toward the lives that mattered. In the years ahead, new generations will continue discovering the Boston Strangler case. Some will approach it as a mystery. Some as a historical investigation. Some as a lesson in forensic science. Some as a study of criminal psychology. All of those perspectives have value. But none should overshadow the people at the heart of the story. The women whose lives ended inside apartments they believed were safe. The families who spent decades searching for answers. The investigators who refused to stop looking for truth. The survivors who carried memories of terror long after the headlines disappeared. They are the true legacy of this case. Not the nickname. Not the legend. Not the speculation. The people. And so, as this story finally comes to a close, we are left with an image that feels fitting. A city at night. Apartment windows glowing softly against the darkness. Lives unfolding quietly behind those walls. People trusting that home is a place of safety. People believing tomorrow will arrive like any other day. Most of the time, that belief is justified. Most of the time, ordinary life continues exactly as expected. But history occasionally reminds us how fragile that certainty can be. The Boston Strangler case is one of those reminders. A reminder of vulnerability. A reminder of perseverance. A reminder that justice is often imperfect. A reminder that truth sometimes emerges slowly, one piece at a time. And above all, a reminder that behind every infamous case are human beings whose stories deserve to be remembered long after the mystery itself fades. Because in the end, the greatest measure of justice is not whether a case becomes famous. It is whether the people who suffered are never forgotten. And more than 60 years later, the victims of the Boston Strangler still deserve that remembrance. Long after investigators filed their final reports, long after journalists moved on to newer headlines, and long after the city of Boston learned to live without the daily fear that once gripped its streets. The story of the Boston Strangler continued to cast a shadow across American criminal history. Not because it was the deadliest serial murder case. Not because it involved the most victims. But because it exposed something deeply unsettling about the nature of truth itself. Most people believe truth is a destination. A final answer waiting at the end of a long road. A point where every question is resolved and every uncertainty disappears. The Boston Strangler case challenges that belief. It suggests that truth can sometimes exist in fragments. Pieces of certainty surrounded by areas of doubt. Answers that illuminate part of the picture while leaving the rest hidden in darkness. The murders began in a city that trusted its routines. Women answered doors without fear. Neighbors assumed familiar neighborhoods were safe. Families believed danger belonged somewhere else. Then, one victim at a time, that illusion began to crack. A knock at a door became something ominous. A stranger carrying a clipboard became suspicious. A woman living alone became vulnerable in ways many had never considered before. The murders changed behavior because they changed perception. And perception is powerful. A city does not need to witness violence directly to feel its impact. Sometimes fear spreads faster than crime itself. The Boston Strangler became more than a criminal investigation. He became a symbol. A symbol of uncertainty. A symbol of vulnerability. A symbol of the terrifying possibility that danger can wear an ordinary face. Perhaps that is why the case remains so memorable. Many infamous killers operated in secrecy. Many committed crimes hidden from public view. The Boston Strangler operated in a way that seemed to challenge the very idea of safety. The victims were not disappearing from isolated highways or remote forests. They were being attacked inside homes. Inside apartments. Inside places that should have represented security. The psychological impact was enormous. Even today, when reading the case files decades later, one can almost feel the anxiety that settled over Boston. The hesitation before opening a door. The second glance through a window. The instinct to check a lock twice before going to bed. Fear transforms ordinary actions. The residents of Boston learned that lesson firsthand. Yet if fear became part of the story, courage did as well. The courage of investigators who continued working despite mounting pressure. The courage of families who endured years of uncertainty. The courage of survivors like Beverly Salmons, whose testimony helped illuminate part of the darkness surrounding the crimes. The courage of communities that refused to surrender completely to panic. History often focuses on criminals because criminals create dramatic narratives. But courage deserves equal attention. Because every act of violence creates people who must continue living afterward. And continuing is not always easy. For the families of the victims, life moved forward whether they were ready or not. Seasons changed. Years passed. Children grew older. Parents aged. New memories formed alongside old grief. The world continued turning. Yet somewhere in every family affected by the murders, there remained a moment frozen in time. A telephone call. A police visit. A devastating piece of news that permanently divided life into before and after. Those moments never completely disappear. They become part of family history. Part of personal identity. Part of the invisible weight carried through the years. Perhaps that is why remembering victims matters so much. Because murder attempts to erase. It removes futures. It silences voices. It interrupts stories before they reach their natural conclusion. Remembering becomes an act of restoration. A way of acknowledging that a life mattered. That a person existed beyond the circumstances of their death. That they were more than a case number. More than a newspaper article. More than evidence in an investigation. The women connected to the Boston Strangler case lived entire lives before they became victims. They laughed. Worked. Dreamed. Loved. Worried. Planned. They occupied a world far larger than the final chapter history often assigns them. And perhaps that is the perspective most worth preserving. Not how they died, but that they lived. As for Albert DeSalvo, history will likely continue debating his role for generations. The DNA evidence linking him to Mary Sullivan's murder is powerful. The confession remains compelling. Yet the lingering questions surrounding the broader series of murders continue inviting examination. Future researchers may uncover new information. Previously overlooked documents may emerge. Old evidence may reveal something unexpected. History is filled with surprises. But even if no new discoveries ever occur, the debate itself serves a purpose. It reminds us that justice requires scrutiny. That evidence matters. That certainty should never be assumed simply because a narrative feels satisfying. The Boston Strangler case remains a cautionary tale against easy conclusions. Human beings naturally seek stories with clear endings. Heroes and villains. Questions and answers. Beginning and conclusion. Real life rarely offers such neat structure. Reality is often more complicated, more frustrating, more ambiguous. The Boston Strangler case stands as one of the clearest examples. A confession without complete closure. A suspect without murder convictions. A DNA breakthrough without total certainty. A mystery that appears solved and unsolved at the same time. And maybe that contradiction explains why people continue discussing it more than half a century later. Because the case reflects something fundamentally human. The desire to understand. The refusal to stop asking questions. The hope that truth can eventually be uncovered, even when decades stand in the way. In many respects, the investigation never truly ended. It simply changed form. The detectives are gone. The crime scenes belong to history. The city has transformed. But the search for understanding continues in books, archives, documentaries, classrooms, and conversations. Each generation revisits the evidence. Each generation asks the same questions. And each generation arrives at its own conclusions. That ongoing search may be the final legacy of the Boston Strangler. Not certainty. Not closure. But inquiry. A reminder that truth matters enough to pursue, even when complete answers remain out of reach. As the story fades into history, one image remains. Not the image of a killer. Not the image of a prison cell. Not the image of a courtroom. Instead, the image is quieter. A row of apartment windows glowing against a Boston evening. Inside each window, an ordinary life unfolding. Someone reading a book. Someone speaking on the telephone. Someone preparing dinner. Someone making plans for tomorrow. Simple moments. Fragile moments. The kind of moments people rarely notice until they are gone. The victims of the Boston Strangler lost those moments. Their families lost them too. That loss cannot be undone. No investigation, no verdict, and no scientific breakthrough can change that reality. But memory can endure. Names can endure. Stories can endure. And as long as those stories continue to be told with honesty, respect, and compassion, the victims remain more than a mystery. They remain human. And perhaps, after all these decades, that is the most important truth the Boston Strangler case leaves behind.